officially read it, but I am going to frame it though. Anyways, good evening and welcome to this evening's study session of the City Council. Agendas for study sessions, including concept reviews, can be found by visiting Broomfield's website at www.broomfield.org. Our agenda this evening includes 2 study session items. Seeing there are no action items or concept reviews on the agenda this evening, there will not be any public comments. The study session will be televised on Channel 8 and through live video streaming on Broomfield's website. Our first item this evening is an economic and fiscal update, including 2022 and 2023 budget highlights. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum, and I'll ask staff to summarize.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and community and council. So this is a continuation. We have been working with council from a shift perspective for about 18 months. This is the culmination of the deeper dive that we took in March from a revenue perspective and from an expense perspective. As council is aware, we have through 2021, 2022 into 2023, solidifying that the budget and financial picture is going to be based on revenue and not expenses. Basing it on revenue, you'll see a shift when we get to the rollover amounts that are not artificially inflated. In years prior, when we would have budgets based on expenses and not revenue, it was more inclined to make it difficult to prioritize and reallocate a finite pot of funds. So as we move through tonight, again, solidifying what we talked about at the council retreat. Next slide, please, Jake. I'm going to do the intro. Jeff Romine, economist and all things business development and finance, will do the economic update from a perspective of local, state, and national, and what the trends and forecasts look like. CFO Brenda Ritchie will introduce the revised 2022 budget and what's taking us into 2023. Those 4 items as we move through this presentation as swiftly as we can, although council is well aware, as the community is, this process is complex, as it should be for an almost $500 million budget. The perspectives and the purpose and the objectives that we take into account, particularly when we are looking at the allocation of funds. 2 pieces are vastly different this year than have ever been in years past. And that is the approach that we're taking with regards to development as a whole. So development, not just commercial, but from residential, commercial, retail, dining, and those economic drivers. In order to make future decisions, a lot of our decisions have to be based on understanding where we've been and how that influences where we're going. That's a different conversation than we've been able to have before, even different than last year. Part and parcel tonight will be the debt conversation. From a capacity perspective, it gets back to decisions that were made prior to this council and even the prior council, impacts where we are and what we look like as we move forward with regards to priorities and budget. Next slide, please. We didn't have a full account nor repository for the hundreds of business development agreements that have been agreed upon over the last, say, 20 years. It's been a lift, and the residual effect of not having a central repository is there's not any one given point in time where you can have a comprehensive overview of your current obligations. Clearly, current obligations influence and impact all future decisions, whether they be debt related, sales tax related, or capacity related. We now have a very good sense, rightly so, council's been on this journey, for where we are in those prior obligations. Now it comes to the difficult part. We've said over the last year that this council and leadership, quite frankly, have an unenviable position, which is not being the council and staff of fun, jazz hands, of new and all of the great exciting things that are yet to come, but a more reserved, disciplined staff and council for making decisions through the lens of being sustainable and having resiliency. Resiliency doesn't mean getting knocked down and getting back up. Resiliency means learning from where we were in order to anticipate what comes next, and having a structure in place that is sustainable beyond this leadership team and council for those future decisions. As we move closer to build out, that's really the driving force of how we look to our short-term and long-term budget. Next slide, please, Jake. Again, the building the financial stability is a 36-month journey. It's not anything that we can switch, flip a switch on and or off. It is something that requires tenacity, structure, and disciplined decision-making, which accounts for how we talked a little bit about the council retreat. It's not really about reprioritizing. It's about reallocating the funds that we have coming in. So as Brenda moves through what our revenue stream coupled with the expenses, what that overall high level view looks like. This is the first introduction to the 2023 budget. So these are simply the highlights. We're not getting in the weeds tonight. We'll have an opportunity for more sessions to do a deeper dive, starting with the individual council department head presentations, where you'll have an opportunity. They've all done their videos, which is very stressful for any of us that have done those. Abby, it's not Snapchat. What is it?
Google Meet recording.
Oh, we just did Google, but you know, like the boards and commissions when we do our videos.
Oh, Spark Fire.
Thank you very much. Those spark fires it's very intimidating. So we know that council will take the time and look at each one of those departments and have their updates. Next slide, Jake, please. Again, the build out, our budget that we'll be reviewing. Again, none of this should be an aha moment. Introduced it, solidifying it. Now you're seeing the tangible results of the focus session, which is a shift from new to existing. Having the disciplined approach to shore up the infrastructure that we have and ensuring that we have funds now and in the future for those backbone services. Preventative maintenance, and really, and again, it's the non-sexy stuff. It's not the programs and or the projects necessarily that get or garner a lot of the colored pictures and fun slides, but rather we have built so much new without taking care of what that backbone and structure looks like. It's put an immense amount of pressure on our current infrastructure, which is requiring us to either elevate those CIP projects. Katie Allen actually is here tonight on vacation. To heck of a way to spend your vacation. Katie, no pressure. I'm sure she loves the fact that I called her out. Again, as we move through, it's a shift. And so it's not just a shift for the community. It's not just a shift for council. It's a shift for staff as well. Shoring up that infrastructure body, and council will see the goals shifting from 80-20. Can't have a pendulum swing or it's not sustainable. So when we're talking about those CIP dollars moving into a graduated approach to get to 50-50, 50% new, 50% maintenance by 2025. Council will also see that when you have additional funds, our approach on the debt is different than it also has been in the past. So we're hoping tonight the community and council leaves with a realistic sense of where we are and the direction that we're going. Next slide, Jake. Mr. Romine.
It's stressing our economy, both locally and nationally. Just as a quick point, as a kind of transition from Jennifer's slides into these, build out's an interesting term as we think about it throughout. And that is one of the things we recognize is build out oftentimes is considered a physical dimension. And we think about that as like, we're going to build the entire area. We are getting close to that level, but at the same time, we're seeing an increasing amount of infill and redevelopment. And so it redefines what build out means. And later on after this presentation, we have our friends and our colleagues from Macerich, they'll be talking about one of those infill redevelopment sites, which is Flatiron's Crossing, and talking about that. So it's just a reference to give you some sense of what build out means. And as we approach it, what that means both from a physical standpoint as well as a social and demographic and economic perspective. So looking at the economy, next slide, please, Jake. The national economy, as many of you know, we just had a revised second quarter GDP. It was still negative, but it's been revised upward. And it's the second quarter in a row of a negative GDP. Now that oftentimes that can happen. It's been the intellectual or kind of urban legend that says 2 quarters in a row of a negative GDP results in a recession. We are clearly not in a recessionary period, but we are in a very unstable period. And so really that's the way to think about the economy is there's so much uncertainty that it's overriding even traditional metrics and traditional measures. The population in the U.S. is now 332.4 million based upon the census and the gross sense. The employment in the nation is 153,000 or 153 million persons. That's 46% of our population is employed right now. And that number is going to come up a couple of times, but that gives you some sense of the wherewithal. We're sitting at a 3.5% unemployment. So that's telling you something about, even though GDP has gone negative, we are seeing employment growth and the change in that employment structure. And that'll come through both as we look at a national and state level, but more importantly, as we come down to the local level. Wage and salary increases nationally are at 4.2%. You'll note that in Colorado, it's a much higher rate. It's at 7.8%. So you can get that sense that this economy, both here in the state, but more importantly in the metro area and here in Broomfield, is a much stronger economy than we're seeing even at the national level. The weakness in the economy that many people have talked about is obviously the inflationary levels. We haven't seen those in close to 40 years. They have moderated a little bit, primarily with energy prices coming down and housing prices coming down slightly. But nevertheless, there's still a very frothy economy going on right now throughout. In the state, it's the same thing. In fact, a little bit stronger in many different measures. Inflation's a little more controlled, in part because we are an energy state. And so that's offsetting it. We're also an agricultural state in some ways. And so our inflation is moderated in a couple of measures compared to the nation as a whole. Next slide, please, Jake. From the local standpoint, we are right now at about 76,600, according to the estimates built upon what the state demographers produced for the year 2022. So again, we've grown a little bit since the census. At the same time, 41,600 of our residents in this community are employed right now. And that's a phenomenal amount. That's the highest it's ever been. So we, again, have a very strong local economy. Our residents are doing well. And when you think about firms here in Broomfield, all those those companies in Interlochen, but even the companies on every street throughout the community, we are employing roughly 42,000 people through those firms. And so we're in a parity position from that standpoint. We're one of the few communities that have an equally strong residential base and a commercial base. And that puts us in an enviable position as far as thinking about our revenues from a fiscal standpoint, but also our strengths for going forward. As you have heard many different times in many different ways, we still experience about 15% of our local residents are living and working here in Broomfield. So that means around 35,000 people are driving in someday during the week to work, and our residents are driving out someday during the week. 3 years ago, I would have said driving out regularly, but now we're in a changed economy where oftentimes we're seeing people driving to or going to work 2-3 times a week. In some cases, not at all, but they're still employed by firms here in Broomfield, which is part of the strength, and we're seeing that. There is still a growing return to work here, more so than even in the central cities. And the cities that are the weakest in a return to work are like LA and New York and San Francisco. Denver is a little bit weaker than we are, but we're seeing a stronger return to work in the workplace. And so that's really where we are. From the standpoint of our local economy, our unemployment rate is right around 3%. The wage and salary, obviously the changes there and some of the other activities are similar to what they are in the metro area because we are part of a greater metro economy. The one thing that I would just point out is again, as I mentioned, we're one of the unique communities, both in Colorado, but throughout the nation where we're uniquely balanced. We have a stronger business environment and a higher wage level, both paid to our residents as well as being paid by our businesses. We're usually in the top 3 to 4 with Douglas County, which is primarily the primary part of the tech center, as well as the city and county of Denver and the central CBD areas. So that's where we are from that standpoint. The inflation rate continues to grow, but it is outgrowing the wage levels, but we are starting to see those moderate and change. Next slide, please. As we look, you can see a couple of some of the statistics that we oftentimes put in. These are also will be in the budget packets. As you can imagine, so residential starts, we grew a little bit, about 600, so roughly about a 30% increase. And we expect to slow a little bit in 2023, but nevertheless continue to grow at a faster rate than we've experienced in the past. As you can see, that's the growth within a commercial square footage at the same time. We had a significant building boom and an opening in 2022. We'll slow back down based upon what we believe is happening within the market through the building permits as well as construction. You can see what's going on with property tax, and we'll come back to that a little bit more when we get back into the actual fiscal side of it in the budget side. You can see business formation. And again, those are based on census data. So that's where that information is coming from. And so the note that I would make about both Colorado and then in Broomfield is business formation may be, if I buy a business from you and have to relicense it, it will count as a new business. It's not necessarily a new business, but from the standpoint of kind of a legal entity, it becomes a new entity when somebody else buys it. And so there's new ownership, new names and things like that. So our actual number of firms are right around 1,200, we believe, that are businesses with substantial levels of employment, basically more than 5. And we think that continues to grow. We have experienced that, and we've seen a number of firms that have located. We'll come back to retail sales in a little bit, but you can see that comparison. Part of that is just an adjustment in the retail spending. We were very strong. We continue to be strong, but because we have such a strong base of that and a volume base, we don't grow at the same rate perhaps as some other communities do. And so that's the retail sales activity. Next slide, please. The primary concerns, and this is really where we want to come back to, and this is where we want to focus our attention when thinking about the economy, is that the greatest place of concern or threat is, quite frankly, the consumer. And that's what we're seeing. We have an uncertainty both in the employment market slowly starting to emerge. As you may know, a number of tech companies have begun to either freeze hiring or in fact have laid off. primarily in the west on the two coasts, but it is starting to come through here. So there is starting to be some uneasiness within the consumer markets and thinking about exactly what that future might hold. So there is a little bit more of a conservative approach to spending and a conservative approach to where you might be investing going forward. That volatility is primarily coming both from the international markets. There's high levels of inflation both in Asia and Europe, higher than ours, in fact. And then at the same time, we have the Ukrainian influences and the Russian influences, which will be affecting food prices this winter and will continue to affect energy prices going into the winter, especially around oil and gas and heat and natural gas in Europe. So that will affect the international markets. As many of you know, the U.S. is working to provide additional natural gas into the European market through basically, it's not frozen, but it's non-liquefied in the same way so that it can move through ships and move over into Europe to help offset some of the changes in the Russian production and supply. Interest rates are volatile both here in the U.S., but increasingly volatile across the world. We are, as many of you know, the central bank presidents all met about a week and a half ago in Jackson, and they clearly all indicated a move toward a tightening capital markets, higher interest rates going forward in the next 6 months. So that continues to be there, and everyone is following in that same pattern of all the major banks across the world. Within the workforce concerns, and this is already mentioned, was the unemployment levels. While still very low, we're seeing some changes in the employment activity, especially within some of the key industries. That's part being impacted due to labor costs, but also being impacted due to the availability of talent. And then the concern that perhaps, and this is what happened even in the slowdown in 2000 into 2001, firms began to retract a little bit on their hiring early into the recession in that particular case, and then into this slowdown, we would expect the same thing. So firms are starting to rethink. The inflation, as many of you know, from just even the popular press, there was a long debate about transitory and structural inflation and what that looks like. Food costs have come down a little bit, but they will rise again coming into the winter. So we would expect that to see one of the greatest pressures on the consumer themselves and what they think about from the household budgets and how they make those adjustments. Commodity prices are still tight, both because of production and supply chain issues, but more importantly, just across the board of varying demands. And then finally, luckily, energy has fallen back into around the 70, it's hovering around the $70 range, and it'll move back. At one point, if you recall in the beginning of the COVID, energy prices, oil prices were around $15 a barrel because nobody wanted it. In fact, at some points, the producers were having to pay somebody to take the oil off the well sites. It rose into the 120, 130 range. So a 70 is a pretty moderate level, and that will return a reasonable return to the oil producer, to the oil companies, as well as make the energy prices become more stabilized for our households, and thus have less influence on the household budget. Next slide, please. So as we look at the population influences and exactly what is happening, we can see that continuing pressure, that redevelopment, that new development, all of that is putting pressure on our existing and aging infrastructure. So it's not just new infrastructure that oftentimes we have to think about. Broomfield is now becoming a mature community from that standpoint. And so we are having to reinvest in existing infrastructure to make sure it stays adequate. It meets the needs. Oftentimes, when we think about a redevelopment and an increasing density, we have to think about sizing of pipes again and whether you should go in and open those pipes up and replace them, or in fact, enlarge them and depending on what exactly is going. So as we think about how all of that development comes forward, each of those have different costs. So infill and redevelopment is not necessarily from an infrastructure standpoint completely free. It's that infrastructure does have to be adjusted sometimes. And also there is an age to it. So if you think about first filing as an example, as you've looked at some of the historic pictures of first filing, it's nearing 60 years, 65 years old. And, think about your own homes and think about, the other infrastructure that you have around your home. 60 years is a long time for some of this infrastructure, both because of just the characteristic wear and tear, but also because of the changing sizes. So as we think through this, those impacts of development come back through both on the operational side, but also the capital side. So balanced development, new and infill and redevelopment, while they have different characteristics to the economy and to our fiscal budgets, it also does create some different drags than we perhaps had imagined in the past. Finally, the catalytic developments, why that's always important and why we oftentimes talk about that. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide, but because those allow us to kind of take one step forward in a new direction. And so incrementally, you're kind of moving along and we're seeing infill or other development going along. And then all of a sudden the catalytic allows us to take that buoyant, large step forward and reset something. And so we've had catalytic developments in the past, and we have 3 going on right now, perhaps 4 going on that we're going to talk about tonight. Next slide, please, Jake. So on catalytic development, you've heard updates on 2 of these within the last few months. The third one you'll be getting tonight is as the second item on the study session tonight, and that's Flatiron's Crossing. So this slide essentially provides you a comparison. Several council members have asked for this, and so we wanted to make sure we provided this as part of this conversation tonight. You can see the build periods. We only focused on Center Street out of the baseline area as opposed to the entire baseline. As you know, the entire baseline area is 9,200 housing units, roughly 6 million square feet of commercial space. But in Center Street, this is what was proposed to council roughly a month ago in the concept review, and that gives you that sense. The income aligned units, the item there is, of course, as you know, in baseline, there is not a specific requirement for units to go in at any given time. They're part of the whole. And so that's the roughly 1,000 affordable units that would be coming in. This would be giving of the 1,240 housing units coming into Center Street. This gives that proportional share of that 1,000 plus affordable units. They actually may build more than those number of units within this particular part of the development. So we don't have that specific number yet, as you know, from the concept review. You can see what the retail and dining, the square footage is there. The cost of construction, the way that we calculated, so we did this on an even basis so that we could get a sense of that. And then we estimated it at $400,000 per housing unit. Obviously, some are more expensive than others, and so that we use that as the basis. $250 a square foot for the dining and entertainment, and $325 for the commercial space that is not that, which is the office and other spaces. And so it gives you an even playing field for the cost of construction between those 3 relatively peered developments that are coming forward. Obviously, the difference is in the expected commercial square footage. That 1.5 million square feet in in Flatiron's Crossing, there is an existing 1.2 million square feet in that center already. And so that's the additional 300,000+ square feet that will be coming in the redevelopment. We're trying to figure out how to phrase that correctly, because it's that commitment to that development is not just around the 350,000 square feet to be coming in, but in fact, the full ensuring that Flatiron's keeps moving forward as a primary retail center. The structured parking you can see at the bottom, it gives you some sense. The only note I would make there is on Center Street, as they indicated in their concept review, as the development moves forward and as the time goes and they can intensify and densify that development, then the surface lots would likely be converted into structured parking, but we don't have a timeline for that, so we didn't want to put that in. Next slide, please. This gives you a sense of the comparison of what the revenue would be on the annual sales and the generated sales tax. This is at $400 a square foot. And the reason we use that is because it blends both retail and dining into a single square footage analysis. It's a little bit higher than what we use in our existing long-range financial model that was adopted by City Council. And the reason is we felt that that was more reflective of these types of developments. But it is about 15% higher than what is in the long-range financial plan. And the reason for that is because obviously that's across the city and across all ages of retail and dining. The projected annual revenue is utilizing the existing models as we use them. And so you can see the comparison of those. That includes all revenue sources. So that would include franchise fees, enterprise fees, property taxes, business personal property taxes, everything, fines and everything else. And that's what's in the long range financial plan. So that's how that works across. Those have been, we have an inflationary number to bring them up to 2027 based upon the budget numbers that we're utilizing, both for setting the 2022 or moving the 2022 forward in the 2023 budgets. Finally, the last two items are there, or the last few items are there to give you a sense of what the level of support is that is planned in each of those. So we took the portion of baseline that is just Center Street and estimated what that financial support would look like. You can see what our commitments are on those two pledge sales tax, pledge property taxes. So we think that this is a way to just look at all three of them in comparison. You can see the other financial support, the Met districts, the TIF, and other things in that bottom line. Obviously, as you'll note in Flatiron's Crossing, I think we mentioned this as we move through the council process on that. There are no Met districts intended, and there is no existing TIF. There is not a TIF district, an urban renewal area for Flatiron's Crossing. So therefore, Boulder Valley School District retains 100% of the property tax from that development. Those are the end years of when our support ends, which ties back to the CCOB financial support. Next slide, please. So that gives you a comparison. This slide's out of order, so I'm going to skip to the next one and come back to this. If you go to the next slide, please, Jake. So that gives you a comparison of the catalytic projects. The other thing we wanted to bring up today, as we mentioned in the memo, and we wanted to make sure that you had a sense is over the last couple of council study sessions, there's been discussions about, including the library and others, about some capital projects that maybe council wants to entertain or consider. So what we did is we put together a list as best we could of what we thought was that holistic list of consideration, those possible projects. And so this is that list. We've grouped them into 4 categories per the discussion. And so these would be the types of projects that you all have mentioned, which is including the police and police headquarters and courts, the rehab and expansion of that facility, the Northeast Police Station that would be contemplated up in the Northeast side. No specific location yet. The improvements and the rehab and expansion of the Eisenhower Library as referenced in the last study session, the Northeast Library and Arts Building, which would be a new facility up the Northeast, the staffing related to that expansion, a housing opportunity fund. A couple of council members have mentioned a couple of different times about how should we think about investing deeper into housing opportunity, affordability, and income aligned housing. So we listed that as a placeholder. The one note I would make there is we put in a $4 million estimate of what that would likely be, but that would include about $1 million that potentially could come from cash in lieu, depending exactly where all that sits. So the idea is part of it would be a new funding source or whatever, as well as cash in lieu. Transportation, road, bike, ped improvements throughout the city. Since that hasn't been defined as deeply, we haven't made an estimate yet on that. Accelerating CCOB infrastructure and vehicle, we haven't estimated exactly. So that would be taking, instead of just our normal CIP investment and buying additional vehicles and adjusting vehicles as we go through that process, this would be accelerating that and doing that more holistically and more quickly. I think that was one of the conversations in one of the study sessions. And then finally, a residential business support program that would be perhaps ways to incentivize residences and businesses to make those conversions into a more sustainable energy or a more sustainable water approach, primarily energy in this case, because the water would come from the other side, that special district. So all of that, if we were to do it all, I think Council Member Lindstedt had mentioned, well, if we're going to think about this rather than doing one at a time, perhaps do it. So we did total it for you. And we thought, just to give you some sense, the estimated amount would be about 231 million. As you can see, what we did is we gave you what would be for the mill increase, what that would be also for the property tax. This would be on a regular median resident, roughly $600,000 home. So that give you what sense that change in the property tax would be. And then you can also see it on the sales tax side. So it's 0.1% or whatever. And then you can see what that would be on the purchase of a $10 item. So it'd be a 14-cent increase in sales tax on the $10. If you go back to that previous slide, Jake, I'm sorry that I got them out of order. This is how we did the calculations. You can pull this straight out of our budget and do this same math. So there's nothing tricky here. 1 mil equals about $1.5 million in revenue to property tax to the city and county of Broomfield. 1/10 of 1% is about 1.48 million. It's a little interesting that they were that equal, but that's where they sit based upon our base on both of those sides. So 1 mil equals about a $40 increase in property taxes, and 1/10 is a 1 penny on $10 purchase. And then the other reference, I think it was Mayor Pro Tem had asked the question, what is our sales tax rate? So I thought I'd put it up here just so that, because I thought it was 8.15, but we wanted to make sure we knew exactly what it was. It is 8.15. That's including state, RTD, and Science Cultural Fund, as well as the city and county of Broomfield. And then finally, as part of that, we've shown you what the nearby communities are. So this is our surrounding communities, and they range from 8.445% to 8.845%. And so that gives you some sense of what that environment is that we live in. On the property tax side, you can see the same things. And there, as you can tell, many of our communities have different mill levies. There's all kinds of variability within that between metro districts. And, as you know, Boulder has a fire department, we don't. And so making those comparisons a little bit more difficult. And so the reference here is we set in 2001, the city council through the voters set our mill rates at 28.968. And that has stayed in place ever since. We've not increased it. Many of our nearby communities have increased their localized mills or their county mills, both the city and town mills and the county mills. And so as we go deeper into this conversation, we'll be happy to dig deeper in and provide more information. But this gave you, the point here was both for the catalytic as well as this interesting capital projects or the potential capital projects. We wanted to give you that quick sample as part of this conversation to inform you as you go through the rest of the presentation. So at that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brenda Ritchie, the CFO of the city, and she'll carry on from here. Oh, I do have one slide? Oh, sorry. Oh, the wrap-up slide, sorry. This is kind of our shared slide, so it's actually good that I've called her out. And so going back to those key points that I'd mentioned, we have the economic outlook and we know what it is, and those things then translate into our budget in particular ways. Obviously, the labor construction costs will push up. They pushed up on the housing prices. They will continue to do that. So we're going to continue to see housing price increases on new homes, but it'll likely moderate because the market changes. Property taxes will continue to rise, both due to appreciation and the building activity. So what we mean by that is the holistic property, not just the property tax on your home or a home, but overall because of the appreciation in building. Retail sales taxes will grow, but they're adjusting, and that's the real key. We continue to see the growth of online and experiencing purchasing, and that's adjusting the goods purchase ratios. Those are the things that really do create the influences directly onto the revenue side of the budget as well as the expense side. And so the key point is, and that's why it's in stars, is we do expect revenue to continue to grow at a slow rate. And you're going to hear Brenda talk a little bit more about that. And we do expect the expenses to likely, not just likely, but to grow at a faster rate than the revenues. And so we'll continue to put pressure on our budget just as it has in the past. And so thinking about how revenue can be grown holistically beyond just changes in, inflation rates and other things is really going to help us meet our expenses going forward. So at that, I really will turn it over to Brenda. Thank you.
Good evening. So I really appreciate City Manager Hoffman as well as Jeff Remine kind of setting the stage, not just for our economic outlook, which leads into our budget and our fiscal perspective, but really helps, I think, understand those pressures, as Jeff was mentioning, that influences how we make choices and those decisions that need to be made as those pressures continue. So moving to the next slide, we'll just give a high level overview. And as Manager Hoffman indicated, you'll be receiving a packet tomorrow that will have all of the details related to the proposed budget to kind of back into all of this. But we wanted to start with your financial budget principles. And so really the key here is recognizing that our budget plan is just that, a plan and a development tool for how we intend to spend money. And best laid plans, we conservatively project our revenues and expenditures. We understand what it is that we need. We focus that and readjust based on that allocation of what we have available. Manager Hoffman has mentioned probably in the last 18 months how we're really focusing and trying to drive home what revenues are we actually receiving. Now, we also understand that we don't budget based on all of the revenue we truly anticipate to come in, because if we say we anticipate all of the property tax, all of the sales tax to come in, and we then find ourselves obligating through expenditures, what we do is create a liability and a risk for ourselves. So what we want to do is be prudent and conservative in those measures as we move forward through the budget. So that's what the continued practice that we take as we develop the budget. Next slide. So here are some key components related to not just 2022, but also influences on 2023 outside of those economic pressures that Jeff had mentioned. So I'll just go ahead and start there, is that we recognize that we are seeing anywhere on our operational side from our standard CPI has been historically 3 to 4%. We are seeing upwards from 8 to 30% on various items. So you're seeing things related to capital costs, and we'll see that in our capital revisions, where we're increasing upwards of 30%. And in terms of fuel, cost of materials, that supply chain demand that's occurring or lack thereof is really causing that tightening of the markets. So what we're trying to anticipate is balancing that with the revenues that are coming in. And Jeff mentioned, we're growing at a slower rate of revenues versus our expenditures. So you'll see a slow incline of our revenues, whereas our expenditure rate is going at a much higher inverse relationship. So what we're trying to do is mirror the two of those together. And that comes into play as we look forward into not only our capital, but also our operating. One of the aspects that will be different for the 2022 revised budget is the addition of the 20 million of Arpa funding that we've received in 2022 and 2021. So with that, there will be, if you're just taking a snapshot of 22 revised and comparing it to maybe 21 or even looking forward to 23, it's important to keep in mind that you will see a dip in the 23 revenues, and that's strictly associated with those one-time revenues. The other aspects that the revenue projections, again, we still anticipate to remain strong as we've been talking about, but we're not going to be over projecting or over budgeting. Next slide, please. So this slide is really just to help illustrate from the perspective of where are our dollars being funded, where do we focus those efforts? And it's really to ensure a safe, a vibrant community and really promote not just the community, but our organization as well. So this slide highlights our areas of focus, combining council priorities with all of the elements that the budget in certain components will have in terms of our commitment, where those dollars are funded. Next slide, please. This slide should be maybe familiar to most of you, but what it does is a great overview and highlight of all of our various programs and services that are offered, but then categorizing them by the very distinct buckets or funding sources, if you will, and neither the two shall meet. So if you've got governmental funds, we can't take that and use that to support our fiduciary or our enterprise fund. And I'll talk quite a bit today about our enterprise funds, which is for those, just as a reminder, it's serves as a business, if you will. So really all of the revenue that's collected or charges for those services need to be enough to cover the cost of those services. So in order for ensuring safe water, not just the transport, the collection, the storage of the water, but maintaining those levels, those federal mandates to ensure the quality of that water is delivered, those costs we're seeing extraordinary rises and pressures against what that is costing us. Therefore, as we'll see in the upcoming utility rate proposed ordinance changes in the coming months around those discussions, why it's important that we need to keep pace. Because if we don't, what we do is run the risk of deferred maintenance or not being able to keep up. We might find ourselves where other communities where we're seeing having to address water issues or the quality of water because they're not keeping up to those mandates. So that's why it's really critical to ensure that the level of cost is matched with the charges for services. But again, as you see, the governmental funds is really flexible and usually mostly our operations and capital. Fiduciary has to do with our pensions, typically pass through is also. So we collect on behalf of a lot of entities as a city and county regarding our property taxes, but that we don't retain, and we'll see that in the next couple of slides. We actually pass that through to those other entities. Next slide, Jake. So here's our current major revenue categories and associated percentages. This is just to highlight the areas of our budget in 2022 where we see our dollars going in terms of collections. And as you see that sales tax and property tax, as well as use tax is, for example, building materials utilized for construction will have a component. Those are often impacted by economic factors. And so here we talk about charges for services. A lot of the community or residents might anticipate that sales tax and property tax is where a lot of those dollars are going to fund operations. And you'll see that actually a lot of the revenue that comes in, while sales tax and property do fund operation, our charges for services, again, related to our utilities, water, sewer, water reclamation, is actually our highest revenue source in the stream. Next slide, please. So here's just another way of looking at it and a historical comparison of those revenue sources. So what we see in 2021 through 2023 proposed, you'll see a big jump in 2023. That is related to the anticipated charges for services related to the proposed upcoming ordinances related to the utility fees. So that is anticipating that those will get adopted. If not, then we will readjust those projections. But a majority of those revenues are associated with in 2023, anticipating moving forward with those utility rates. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we receive property tax, sales tax, and the next couple of slides what they'll do is provide a collections, how we collect the revenue, how it's distributed, and how it goes out in terms of how it's being used. So for property tax, for example, we receive approximately 28.9 mils. We have various metro districts within Broomfield and can have a much higher mill levy rate. Of that, Broomfield really, so if you're looking at a property tax bill, Broomfield only receives 25% of that total property tax bill, which is used to fund operations and capital. The rest, as you can see, big majority, almost 50%, is allocated to the school districts, and those are used to fund all of the school districts, special districts, as well as fire. And just for a note, since the creation of a city and county in 2001, Broomfield has not increased its mill levy. Next slide, please. In terms of our sales tax collections, again, Mr. Romine had hit on this. Our total sales tax collection is 8.15%. I mean, sorry, the rate is 8.15%. We collect 50% of that, which is the sales tax rate for the city is 4.15. So approximately 63 million of total collections, we get half of that. It's used to fund our capital and our operations. And a portion of that is used to also, so 25 cents for every dollar is allocated towards open space initiatives. Next slide, please. And as we'll hear from our partners at Mace Ridge later this evening, and as Jeff was kind of talking through the catalytic development, the tie-in of those economic pressures, where we're seeing that strong economy, this slide is just to highlight where we have been and where we're going. It's a great indicator to say that the sales tax we received in the general area for the Flatirons area which includes our village, marketplace, Main Street, and the mall, in 2020 collected 10 million, approximately 10 million in revenue. In 2021, we saw collections jump to 15.7. In 2022, we're anticipating that to grow as well. As we move forward and as we're coming out of the pandemic, if you will, that consumer behavior and the ability to spend those dollars is going to become more restrictive. So, but however, this has been an economic engine and indicator for how Broomfield and its development as we move forward into the future is really that catalyst in terms of being a generator for sales tax. So this was just to help highlight the growth and what we anticipate in terms of tying into that strong economy. Next slide, please. And so our last slide here, again, charges for services. Broomfield charges and collects 100% of that. And that is strictly because that is a business that we operate, if you will. A majority of that has to do with the water, sewer, and water reclamation. The other category is going to be associated with your recreation and fees for programs and other services. So of that, you see a majority of that is used for the utility operations and capital, and then a small percentage for recreation is further distributed. Next slide, please. So as we move into expenditures, next slide, Jake. On the flip side, we can take a look at the historical comparison. So in 2021, we saw a large increase, and that was primarily due to the fact that our Windy Gap, we had funded in the fall of 2021, if you recall, we had funded a $133 million taken on additional debt and bonded for the Windy Gap project. We also, in 2022, as well as 23. So in 23, you don't see that carry forward for capital, but in 2022 revised. So if you keep in mind, every year we appropriate the budget based on a new budget being what we anticipate for capital. Then we come back at the beginning of the first quarter to say, we have projects that didn't complete within the previous year. We had grants that didn't roll forward. They need to be rolled forward because we didn't complete everything within the fiscal year. So we come back in the beginning of the first quarter and ask for those funds to be allocated. So we will anticipate that 2023 original budget will shift very similar to what you see here on the revised budget to include those capital and grant payments. Next slide, please. This is just another way of looking at all of our funds in total and then the distribution of where our expenditures are. As you can see, a majority of that has to do with operations and capital. And as we're seeing in terms of also from a personnel labor market force and the capital projects increasing related to inflationary pressures, those pieces of the pie are starting to increase at a larger portion. We also have our obligations of debt and debt service, which we'll talk about shortly. And then fiduciary, again, those pension payments, the pass-throughs to other entities that we collect on their behalf is another large portion of our expenditures of money coming in, but also going out. So it's a 1-for-1. Next slide, please. So this slide is just to highlight on our general governmental funds, what we're seeing as it relates to our budget. So we have on one side of the house, your operating and your capital make up your total operating, your total governmental funded services, and they're broken out to high level personnel and other operating, if you will. And what we're seeing here is the percentages in the buckets reflect the percentages of the budget that those represent, and the indicators below are what we're seeing in the average annual increase. And so overall, we're seeing about a 6% increase for next year. But again, it's just a high level to say that costs are increasing, and we're seeing that here in our expenditures. Next slide, please. One of our biggest resources and assets is our personnel and our staff. And one of the things that this slide demonstrates is the population increases. We've actually not kept up pace with that. However, we are, as we'll see in next couple of slides, making up for that in terms of being competitive, retaining recruitment in terms of our salary packages. And so if you look at, next slide, please, how we're shifting from our personnel costs from 2022 original to 2023 proposed, there's a large jump. And so to highlight some of the aspects that are related to that is because if you recall, in the beginning of this year in April, we came forward with a budget amendment to address the compensation, meaning equal work for equal pay, so that individuals were assessed and an evaluation was done by our Human Resources Department to ensure that classifications and individuals in those classifications were appropriately marked within their range, and also moving those ranges up to current market data, meaning historically we used to use old data, I shouldn't say old, aged data that was not current and relevant. What we did was bring that current and relevant to be competitive in the market. And so that created an increase of approximately 4.2. Then we had our general market, our merit increases that added to that as well. We also made a shift from prior budgets. If you'll notice, is that a shift in personnel increase, because historically we used to budget in attrition. What that means is for on average, 3% of our personnel at any given time would not be funded. So you would have a vacancy savings, if you will. So we don't always have, we might budget for 1,000 people, but we might have only 800 people as the previous slide showed. So what we're trying to do is make up for that, because again, we want to make sure that as we move forward, we're ensuring that just like with our contracts and obligations, at any point, we have the money available to ensure that we can pay those individuals. Other aspects that are impacting the 2023 budget is going to be our life and disability premiums, which is a 30% increase. We've seen that rise. We're able to remain consistent and constant on our medical, dental, and vision premiums and our contributions there. There's also an increase related to our employee assistance programs. I will say, however, we're still in the process of negotiations, so those rates can change, but that's what we're currently seeing in the market as we're looking out at that. So if there is a change, we will come back with a budget amendment, but we are currently negotiating those rates to ensure that we're getting the best deal. Next slide, please. So here's just a general snapshot of where we are and where we project to be in the next 5 years associated with our general governmental funds. And we do this historically just to project out our expenditures based on CPI, and then our revenues based on, you'll see a jump every other year, and that's related to the property taxes. So we anticipate that the assessment in 2023 will cause a jump in 24 and 25, and then another one in 27. So as we move forward, that's taken into consideration, but we would, because again, our property tax assessments are done on odd years, the assessments are done, and then we collect the revenues for the prior period. So as you can see, we do anticipate that forecast to go negative, but we always have a strategically sound, balanced budget that we come forward with and propose. Next slide, please. So one of the aspects that was mentioned earlier was capital projects and that reinvestment. And one of the philosophy shifts that we are moving towards is to ensure that we are focusing on taking care of what we have and that reinvestment. So it's not to say that we won't do anything new, but it's ensuring that we have set up the proper structure to take care of the existing projects and allocate funding appropriately. Next slide, please. So here's just a highlight of some projects that we're moving forward with. We're continuing related to our utilities. Again, a big component of being able to service those booster stations for the water delivery and the sewer stations, as well as maintaining the streets, those basic infrastructure programs, as well as completing existing projects, ensuring that we have dedicated the funding to projects that have already been through the pipeline, whether they're 50 to 80% complete. We want to ensure that we are focusing our dollars and efforts there. And then we have other transportation projects. And I know Katie Allen so graciously came on her vacation to help answer any questions related to this. But again, the slide is just to highlight that impact that that shift in terms of understanding that we're taking care of what we have and balancing that with new. Next slide, please. The other component related to capital will be the upcoming ARPA funded projects. So as you recall, Broomfield was awarded 20.7 million in 2021 and we received in 2022. So we had several projects that we came to council with back in November. However, given all of the cost increases related to projects and the bids that we were getting back, it was determined that we would focus our efforts on the first 3 projects. And the reason being is because the ARPA funding is stipulated to have a very specific focus on ensuring equity component among the dollars that are distributed for those the areas that were impacted by the pandemic. And so it's investing in our water, our sewer, our broadband infrastructure was the biggest bang for the buck. Again, these were existing capital projects. And in order to alleviate aspects of the general fund, we determined that this would allow for that. The reason, again, we're coming forward with these 3 projects is because of the cost increases negated coming forward with the other projects. So we intend in the first amendment, actually the end of this year, when we come forward with the contracts, to have a budget amendment associated specifically with each of these first 3 projects. And then in terms of the revenue funding recovery, we have some flexibility, but that will determine and depend on what the pricing and the bids come back from the solicitations on the top 3 projects. Next slide, please. So just a few things I want to highlight regarding the budget. One, we are continuing to propose a balanced, structured budget, and we are on track to exceed our minimum reserve levels by having 16.67% again associated with our reserves. So that's ensuring 2 months of operations is what that is. And our goal is to, as the years go by, as we have additional funding, be putting aside additional money for those reserves. For the 29th year, we've received the Gfoa Budget Distinguished Award, and that is something that we're proud of. That is reflective of our 2022 budget, and we anticipate, since we use the same methodology and structure, that we would receive that for our proposed 23 budget, but just wanted to highlight that as something that that's an achievement and a mark that we continue to move forward with. We've also reaffirmed our bond rating in terms of being a AA3 for Moody's. So for those from a personal perspective, you got TransUnion, Equifax, Experian for your personal credit. In the municipal bond world, it's S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. And again, given all of our bond, which we'll talk about here shortly, is we're still maintaining a high level of rating, which is great. And then again, just kind of looking towards taking care of what we have, ensuring that we are setting aside, focusing our efforts on the budget to allocate those dollars to taking care of that. And some challenges that we're seeing that we're facing are across the board in terms of increased capital needs and those associated escalated costs. Same with the labor market challenges. So we have, with the latest economic report, job openings, you have the number of job openings versus the number of unemployed, right? So those looking for jobs that are eligible, it makes it difficult in order to be able to maintain that competitiveness and retain, not just retain, but attract that, because there is so much out there. The other thing is the insurance premiums rising, which we mentioned. So not just insurance premiums related to healthcare, but if you look at property and casualty, we've actually just last year alone, and in the revised budget, what you'll see is over $500,000 that we've increased in our property and casualty liability claims. So those costs continue to rise as you deal with cybersecurity. We're seeing that across with a lot of neighboring areas having to deal with that. And so not a lot of companies are willing to back those types of insurance. So those rising costs are factoring in there as well. Next slide. So we move on to everybody's favorite topic, debt. So just a high level overview. We have 3 types of debt here at Broomfield. And so one is our certificate of participations, which is basically a lease aspect. Our revenue bonds, which is funded by sales tax, and then on our enterprise bonds. So that's going to be our special revenue related to waters, wastewater, and sewer. So next slide, please. So this slide is high level, wanting to give folks an opportunity in the council to take a look at what we have outstanding thus far. And what we have to date, if you look at that total, just principal alone, roughly $454 million of debt, which again, given a community this size, is not a bad thing. It's just that because our current revenues is 560. So we are at, if we had to call everything and, pay everything right now, we have 1 year's worth of revenues, right? That would pay for that. Not how we operate, but it allows for us to give that perspective. So it's that 1-to-1 ratio. So you see here listed out, we've got the borough general obligation, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. And then the other, which we've talked about, the Flatirons, which was a 2012 refunding of our 2002 bonds, but it also incorporated street improvements. So it's not just all related to the Flatirons. It was also incorporating street improvements that we had done and other improvements related to Broomfield. Then we also have in 2012, we did some expansion of sewer lines and addressed EPA mandates, which required another refunding, and that was done in 2012. In 2017, we did certificates of participation. So related to our library, our Paul Durder Rec Center, detention center, and municipal courts, there was a refinancing and refunding, if you will, for all of those to be combined and set aside in the 2017 debts. The other ones that were taken on most recently of new debt was the Broomfield Community Center, as well as the Dillon Road 144th paving. So all of that, and then obviously the 133 million that we took on last year in terms of the Windy Gap. So that really is just a total picture of where we are. It gives you the year when we're going to retire that bond. A lot of these you can see are near term. And we, as we'll see in the next slide, we've got some opportunities for refinancing, but as we'll see, it's in talking with the municipal bond markets, it's not the time, given the volatility of the market. So next slide, please. The main area we wanted to focus on this evening is related to the event center. So in 2005, Broomfield had engaged in taking on financing the construction of the event center. And so that was really taking on the responsibility of the development at that time. In order to back it, Broomfield as borough decided to take on the debt themselves. And so that total debt was $60 million with an additional $2 million for the land as a subnote. So that's funded through a TIF, and 10% of our city sales tax goes to that, as well as a portion of our property tax to fund that debt. As you move through, you see that we had in 2006 is when the operator moving forward with creating a parking structure, and that agreement also taking on that additional debt. And that was refinanced back in 2019 for those that were here that recalled that there was a letter of credit. What that means is if you're going to borrow and there's not enough money or confidence that there's enough revenue to support the bonds that are and money that is borrowed, there's a letter of credit that's drawn. And so given the timing of the markets and that this specific bank was getting out of that business, we had to refinance that and take on that debt. But that is not, it's associated, but not part of the total debt. It's a separate debt that's that was taken on. In 2021 is a keynote to kind of take a look at. We took on $60 million of debt, and then it wasn't until 2021 that we started getting revenue to cover that debt. But what that means is if your annual payment is $5 million, since 2005 up until 2021, we were not generating enough revenue within that area to pay that $5 million. So what we were doing was borrowing from other URAs to a tune of $36 million. So it was in 2021, as we borrowed that money and started to see the revenues coming in, we decided, we recognize the opportunity to kind of start the discussions with council and figure out the next steps in terms of how do we move forward with, is there an opportunity to refinance? Which we'll see is 2010, we had an Arpa, it was the first callable date on the bonds. So you were able to say, if the market was ripe for it, we could have gone at that time. However, right now, one of the things that we're seeing again with the municipal bond market is not recommended to move forward with any type of refinancing given the volatility. So we'll continue. We just went into an agreement. It's backed by a letter of credit. So we have agreed that another year, the bank will back a letter of credit for these bonds. But in speaking with them, they too are looking, similar to the parking garage, are looking to get out of that as well and are looking to possibly not continue with that letter of credit going into 2024, which aligns with the operator agreement, which is set to expire in September of this year. So what we'll do is start those conversations, continue to work with the banks on what opportunities are there, how can we continue to pay down those debts sooner with available funding. But as you'll see, it's not until next year that we anticipate fully recouping, starting to see the revenues within that area to be able to cover those costs. The problem, I wouldn't say problem, the opportunity with this bond is that there is a debt, it's a balloon payment. So at the end of 2031, we will have a $10 million payment. We have not been setting aside money for that $10 million payment. So there's an opportunity beginning next year to begin setting aside additional funds so that we can cover that bond payment when it, if we are not able to refinance. Next slide. So this is just a high level breakdown of that debt. So basically what you'll see, again, specifically for Borough, is the principal and interest. I will say that of the total that we had there, we've paid down $77 million. Of that $77 million, only roughly $55 million is interest, and the other 20 is for principal. So if you're wondering why we took on a $60 million, why it was a $60 million debt and we have a balance of 50 million, that's why, because it's a variable rate, meaning that it on a daily basis, this bond goes against the market, whatever the current market rate is. So if it's at 8%, we are paying that 8% on a daily basis, and that's calculated. So that has contributed to the large portion of debt payment that we've encumbered as far as interest is concerned. But again, in terms of next steps, we're not recommending that we do anything at this time. We will continue to work with our the municipal bond partners and try and figure out what the best opportunities, what options there are. But at this time, given the volatility within the market, we're not recommending to make any moves or do any type of direct purchase at this time. So we'll continue to watch the market and come forward to council when we think there's an opportunity to change that. As we have additional revenue coming into that URA, we anticipate that we'll begin to set aside additional funding so that we can make that balloon payment if we're not able to refund. Next slide. So just from a high level perspective, just giving you a financial picture that we are growing strong in our local economy. As Jeff had mentioned, it's really in terms of that commercial and residential development, but making those choices of what's moving forward. And so Broomfield still has a moderate low tax rate. Again, comparatively in a couple of the documents that you'll get tomorrow, you'll see that comparison among our surrounding communities. I know it was brought up in the last study session about how do we compare. So you'll see that in terms of both property taxes and sales tax. And again, we'll have a balanced budget. We recognize it's statutorily required, but there are communities out there that do not present a balanced budget. Our goal is to ensure that, again, the expenditures going out match or are less than the revenues that are coming in. So as the market drives those different impacts, we'll continue to see and watch those elements and adjust, because again, the budget is a plan. So if we need to move forward and make any amendments, we will. And so again, mentioning the collective debt of 490 million is is less than the total annual revenues that we anticipate bringing in for the community. So next slide. In terms of next steps, we'll be back on the 13th to present the utility rate changes as the first reading on that. And then the documents that are part of the proposed budget will be available electronically for the public and posted on our website, as well as the Broomfield Voice. And then on September 20th, you'll have the opportunity, part of the package that you receive tomorrow are those department head presentations. And so what that will do is give you the opportunity to go through each department, figure out what your questions are. We ask that if you can provide those questions ahead of time to help us prepare, but it's an opportunity for you to have those conversations with our department heads on the 20th. And then on October 11th, we'll have the first reading on the public hearing on the proposed 2023 budget. And then on the 25th of October, we will come back with the finalized 2022 revised budget, as well as the 2023 budget for adoption. And with that, I will close it out and turn over to Selectman.
Is that all?
Is that enough? Is that enough?
Bringing, okay,
Open for questions.
open for questions. So yeah, thank you, Brenda and Jeff, for that incredibly comprehensive presentation. I'm sure because of that, we don't have any questions here on council. But it is time for questions if there are any, and I will remind everyone that we're going to have a 30-second limit on any questions that are off topic or or inappropriate. So having said that, does any member of council, any of my colleagues here have a question? Councilmember Schaaf, you can start us off.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So thank you to staff for all of your work on all these various conversations that are going on. I'm curious with all of this information, and this is kind of a general question, but kind of what are the 3 to 4 takeaways from this information that we have in terms of the upcoming economic forecast, the debt conversations that we're having, and the upcoming budget cycles that we have? What are kind of those top 3 to 4 takeaways that we can hold?
1, we have a finite pot of funds. 2, we need to ensure that prior obligations, whether they be debt, business development agreements, are taken into account for any future decisions. We need to ensure that decisions that are made now and in the future incorporate maintaining the balance between residential and commercial, with a focus on commercial, and that the decisions are intentional and taken from a comprehensive perspective of everything that's happening in Broomfield. We can't look at project by project anymore. It has to be from a totality of circumstances. So let me summarize that, Councilmember Schaaf. Intentional, difficult decisions that are made with discipline, that have a balance with a finite pot of funds now and in the future. There's 2 of them for you right there. I think if we are able through those 2 lenses, we will be able to check the box on all of this comprehensive data that staff has been able to put together for council for their review.
Thanks. So I think that those were similar takeaways from when we had our focus session, up in Estes Park. So I don't think that anything has really changed from that conversation. We've just gotten more in depth with that conversation. So there was some focus on the First Bank Center, and I kind of want to just touch upon that as it kind of encompasses all of those takeaways. So as we look, toward future projects and future expenses, how can we avoid, issues like the First Bank Center? What were the reasons for the expense to create this asset? What were the anticipated reasons for success, and what happened that caused this to be such a huge liability for Broomfield?
just as we cannot predict the future with the crystal ball of what's going to happen, our predecessors that were on this dais and on your dais certainly could not have foreseen what their decisions were. Broomfield was a hot spot. I mean, it was cherry from the debt that we assumed, and Flatiron's folks Mace Rich is here tonight to talk a little bit about that. One of the reasons from a debt perspective, Councilmember Schaaf, so this is going to be a lengthy answer, but an important one. Assuming debt based on a revenue stream that is not a guaranteed revenue stream, anytime that you have urban renewal authorities, you are banking on something that is higher risk. So when our predecessors made decisions based on where we were at the time, we weren't even at 25% build out, which means a community and councils and fiduciary duty, you have a higher risk financial tolerance because you know that you're going to be able to supplement, if you will, higher risk projects. So if you take 5 of them on, you have the capability to absorb 2 not working and 3 that work. When you get closer to build out, your risk tolerance should decrease. So a lot of the conversations and movements that we're having now with regards to infrastructure, shoring it up, transitioning from new to existing, and maintenance and asset replacement, we're about 7 years behind the game. So I don't want to second guess why the decisions were made. We can only make the best decisions that we have right now with what's in front of us, which is a hyper conservative approach than what's been done in the past, simply because we're closer and closer to build out. So our amount of risk that we can absorb, particularly with all the external forces that we have no control over, national economy, inflation, we're less and less likely to be able to accommodate. So when you have a convergence from that totality of circumstances, when you are looking at the Urban Renewal Authority, the tax increment financing and banking on big dollars coming in, and then they don't come in, the money has to come from somewhere. So decisions about refinancing in 2012, we were still in a sweet spot. We were still generating big dollars. Flatirons, we chased Nordstrom's. We really wanted Nordstrom's and we were willing to pay for it. And that bond, we still owed $25 million. The reason that bond is not showing up on our debt is because when we negotiated with Mace Rich, it was a real back and forth. You'll hear about it in just a moment, but absorbing that $25 million that we still owed in their package deal, part of this council and this community and this leadership team made the decision that we were not going to refinance that portion. We were going to swallow hard and pay that $25 million off in 5 years. Council approved that last year. So again, when our economy locally is strong, our books are balanced, we have a positive outlook moving forward. That doesn't mean you spend more, at least in any household. It means that you pay off your debt. And those were not priority decisions that were made in the past with regards to debt. Thus, you can't accommodate the recession. You can't accommodate a pandemic. You're less and less likely to absorb that. So, Councilmember Schaaf, I hope that addresses it from a perspective of having a repeatable decision-making model is really key for Broomfield. It's key now and it's key as we move into the future so that you're looking at through the same lens. And so when we look at the catalytic development projects, those big, the multifaceted developments, which is the only way to make a development happen now because everything is so expensive, minimizing or marginalizing that risk to the greatest extent possible is where we want to live. And everything that we've talked about subsequent to the council focus session reflects that.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. Yeah, I mean, I think that not only do we need to create a, priority decisions and kind of that repeatable decision-making model for the future, but we also have to learn from those previous places where we made those decisions concerning debt. And we need to learn from them to ensure that we don't repeat those because we want to repeat good decisions, not bad decisions. So in the past, we've had projects or operations, and the motto has been find the money. With upcoming projects and operations that will impact future budgets, how will we approach those items? An example is when the BCC, the Broomfield Community Center, was being discussed for construction, the idea for this build was to consider for the future, build it for the future, expand it. And the objective was find the money for that project so that we can do it. What we found out with that project was not only was there increased construction costs and capital costs, but there was also increased money for operations as well associated with that asset. And so how are we looking at these upcoming projects and operations to ensure that we're getting the full picture when we look at these capital projects or operational moves that we have in the future?
Thank you for that question. Two things. One, that it's the first time, believe it or not, that that Broomfield with $500 million in debt, we've never had a debt policy until this council said, let's have a repeatable process through which we view what we take on next. So again, it's an equity lens, right? So it takes us away from having a disciplined approach on some projects and not others. So by implementing the debt policy allows us that formation for a structure for a repeatable process. To your point, Councilmember Schaaf, and staff continually, as we were building this presentation and having the meat on the presentation rather than just having the verbal explanation, so we can continue to go back and refer to that, as can our community, to understand what that decision-making matrix looks like. Part of what we learned from up north was we have to have triggers. So if we say we want balance, we can't do a sign, sealed, deliver development and then come back to say, but what about this and what about this and what about this? So we learned from that. You'll hear from Mace Rich. We knocked it around with them. And when we said affordable housing, no, we can't afford affordable housing. You have to do it. The acquiescing, and it's not flexing your muscle, right? Again, it's that partnership piece. But what we learned from the North area is you have to be able to have those triggers more. You have to do commercial first. We know that the market right now bears residential. And that's where the money is. The market 5 years ago is different than the market now, which will be different than the market 5 years from now. So to your point about that's resiliency. Again, it's not just getting hit with the pandemic and the recession. It's more important than that. It's bigger than that, right? Resiliency is learning from what we didn't know then and what we know now, and we're applying it. Flatiron is an excellent example of that on many fronts. Now that we have a blueprint, we continue to follow that. We ask the same questions for each one of these developments. Comparing apples and apples to the best of our ability, again, allows us to all speak the same language on what the funds are, what the implications are, what the outcome is, and then making decisions based on that totality of circumstances, right, wrong, or indifferent. it's staff's responsibility, fiduciary, to bring the full package, and then council makes the decision, staff responds and executes. So again, we're getting closer and closer to having that repeatable process. Is it 100%? No. But we're damn close on it.
So let me ask this just a little bit more clearly. So when we're looking at a project like the BCC, a project like Dillon Road, and those are kind of the top two that come to mind just because they were both approved and they were big projects. Are we looking at those projects in more of a totalistic view in terms of what are the maintenance costs going to be long-term? What are going to be the operational costs long-term, as opposed to just looking at what does it cost to build that new shiny thing?
Absolutely. And part of that is the calculations. So some of the progress that we have made, we introduced it to council during the focus session, if you all remember, and that was really drilling in for the first time to be able to say, these services that we provide, how much do they cost? And really getting to a per unit cost on each one of those. So again, repeatable process that then we can say, okay, 100 unit development costs us this amount. Additionally, now that we've combined, we've always used to have the county budget and the city budget. Now that we have that combined budget, it's easier for us internally to be able to say, what do each one of those components add to our expenses? And the flip side, what do each one of those households contribute from a sales tax perspective? We didn't have that either. So again, we wanted to have that balanced approach, that it wasn't just what it costs us. What does it make us? What is that ripple effect? Again, to the best of our ability. So when we look at each one of these projects, again, from a totality of circumstances, you all have seen the recent calculations where we have, again, that development matrix that you can plug and play how much the, Jake, would you be kind enough to go back just to the catalytic projects? And Mr. Romine can certainly speak to this a little bit more, Councilmember Schaaf, but again, having this repeatable process. So when we look at, let's just take the number of housing units. When we can say that X number from an expense perspective creates an overall, how we translate that into from the services that we have right now, the service level that we have right now, to your point, not having the staffing built in was a huge conversation. There was probably 7 of us that built this, that built the presentation that council was, that we went through tonight. And repeatedly that we've continued to talk about was that staffing model that needs to be attached with each one of these, particularly when it's from an infrastructure perspective, we're never going to be able to drill down to a voluminous per unit, but we can get pretty close. So we know what an average FTE costs. We know what the numbers are from a community development perspective. We know now from a matrix perspective what each one of those phases are in order to execute on a particular development. That allows us to go back and plug in from a catalytic development perspective what each one of those layers are. Mr. Romine, anything to add on the per unit, whether it be expenses and or revenue?
Sure. And Mayor, Manager Hoffman, Mayor Pro Tem and council members. So as you noticed, even in the most recent study session where we talked about the library, one of the things that was provided was what is the operational expenses that are going to be needed. And I think it was roughly $3 million or 3.2. We put it on that list. And so you start seeing that more frequently now. To Manager Hoffman's point, when we're utilizing that long-range financial plan that was adopted, we're adjusting it. We're going to be coming up with a new model that will actually, we think will be even better. So we stopped using, several of the council members have been out for a while. If you recall, when we talked about the long range financial plan, we used to say stuff like it changed from 1.04372 to 1.04371, and it meant nothing. Because you're talking about, you know, 1,000th%, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense. So we changed even in the way we reference it, and we reference the specific amount. And we share, and we've worked with the development teams that have asked us. We've shared those models and explained exactly what's in it. We can disagree on some of the assumptions, but what we're trying to do is be holistic and talk about the community over time and talk about the community as a whole. So to Manager Hoffman's point, we know we have a rough estimate that we feel pretty comfortable with what a single family home costs. And we've shared that with council, both in the retreat and a number of other times. And that's true square footage for commercial and other things. We also have an estimate of what that revenue is. So we're doing that because that gives you for the individual projects, that kind of representation of expense that's both operational and to some degree capital. It incorporates part of the CIP, the normalized CIP, not these large capital projects. And in those, we've identified it specifically as line item. I think that gets to the rest of your question, Councilmember Shaft.
So that's all I have to say. Thank you, Councilmember Chef. Next would be Councilmember Lindsted. Thank you, Mayor, Pro Tem, Acting Mayor. I just have a couple questions. So on Your Highness. slide 37, I pulled up our ARPA funded projects from January 11th of this year when we looked at it last. Is everything that isn't on this slide that was approved in our study, well, not approved, but brought forward in our study session dead then? Is that removed?
Ms. Ritchie, will you address that? And again, Katie Allen is here primarily because of cost.
Mhm.
Councilmember Lindstedt.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Lindstedt, for the question. So what we're doing is moving forward, we've prioritized the projects and determined that these three would move forward. We'll with the flexibility and availability of that revenue recovery. So that is not as restrictive in terms of what it can be used for. So what we will do is based on what the bids come back related to the first three projects, and we'll determine what those true costs are. It is, as City Manager Hoffman indicated, the reason was the cost escalation. So we've put the priority lower, but we still anticipate, again, they were all programmed within our current capital funding. So if it's not funded through ARPA, that does not mean that we will not move forward with funding it. It'll just, it may be delayed and would be funded through our CIP program.
So everything that has been removed from this proposal in the previous study session was in the overall category of communities disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And now we've escalated our fiber optic connections to be 50% of the total ARPA dollars, is less than they were, or more than they were before. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm a little caught off guard that this is the suggestion, and that maybe this didn't come before council to reevaluate based on the procurement bids and everything else, because I don't know that I'm comfortable with a lot of those cuts coming out of ARPA dollars. I mean, a lot of this was what the whole reason the ARPA dollars came was to help the disproportionately impacted parts of town. So.
Councilmember Lindstedt, in between then and now, we also got the Treasury Department's very, very strict regulations governing ARPA funds and what disproportionately impacted communities would mean. And one of the factors, in addition to what Ms. Ritchie was talking about, was the ability to fit those projects within those buckets for all the federal reporting requirements. So when we do come back to council, we can give you more detail about how that impacted this decision as well.
Okay, I mean, I would like that information before just, saying, oh, here's our proposal, here's our plan buried in a 37-page report. I think it would have been nice to have that earlier, because I think this allocation is disappointing. So I'll just put that out there. And then my next question is, our contract with our the First Bank Center's operator right now, when is that coming before council, and when are we gonna discuss that in the future? I know that was an item we've previously talked about a lot on council.
Sure.
So
Ms. Ritchie, when does that contract expire? We did an extension, Councilmember Lindstedt, because we couldn't have it go dark.
when did we do that?
All of last year. prior
Fall of
to the
last year.
Expiration. It came before, yeah, I believe we presented it in a exec session possibly, or at a study set. We had mentioned that we were extending the contract to renew it. And so it'll go through, it expires in September 30th of next year. So in March of next year is when we will have to reevaluate and look at whether or not we would extend that beyond the term of fall of next year.
Okay, I don't recall that discussion either, but I look forward to, well, we need to have that discussion. So thank you. That's all I have, Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you, Councilmember Lindstedt. Councilmember Holshin.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So I have some general questions about the economic outlook. Just out of curiosity, a high level, you said 85% of people that live in Broomfield go outside of Broomfield to work. Does that take into consideration someone who is remote work? For example, I work for a company that used to have an office. I used to work in an office down in downtown Denver, but now I'm remote. So how does that take that into consideration? How does that impact our financial plans, I guess?
So council member, in all honesty, we had really good travel data before the COVID. So before 2019, there was a lot of census data and others where they looked at the relationship between employment and work locations and home locations. There has not been a study done since. And so we do think that it's evolved, but during that previous period and the data that we had, which was that roughly 15% amount, that did include people that were working at least 1 day a week in an office. And so what that meant is back then, as everyone knows, there was very little, there was some teleworking. It has now become a major part of it. So we're looking forward to what the Census Bureau and Department of Transportation will be able to develop, but we don't have any specific data from, we'll say, the last 6 months.
What impact does that have on our economic outlet? As far as, I mean, I understand how it impact transportation policy and things like that, but does it impact sales track projections?
It impacts in two ways. So interestingly enough, Brenda and I, as one of Jennifer's directives or directions, I shouldn't say directives, not like she threw something down on us and we all, but as we began to think through the COVID and what the impacts are going to be on the budget, we actually estimated our retail spending was going to fall more than it actually did. And part of that is because we anticipated restaurants effectively being shut down and what that impact would be. What we ended up seeing in our retail spending, and this is what the data showed, was there was an increase in retail spending in certain categories, as you can imagine now after we've gone through it. And there was also some increase in food spending, both at the grocery stores, because that's their planting of restaurant spending back into grocery stores. But we, as Broomfield specifically, gained restaurant spending over what we had seen because so many residents were now working from home. And so they were getting food through delivery services and takeout. So we actually, compared to, we'll say, Denver's downtown, did not have as a significant impact as we expected, even though we had a high concentration of employment in Interlochen. So the results of that suggest that we're going to see uneven results in other ways. One thing that we've been trying to watch very carefully in monitoring, working with commercial real estate folks, is what degree of subleasing or people moving from their leases. At this point, based upon the information that at least I've had anecdotally and from talking to folks, and you can ask this question of our friends from Macerich later, we've actually seen a strong real estate market remaining in Broomfield, both on the commercial side, on office as well as retail. And so it's work. But we aren't seeing companies leave. What we're seeing them do is reallocate the space from, we'll say, and I'm making this number up, but something like 75 feet per square feet per employee back up to, let's say, 120. And so they're moving their employees further away to allocate it rather than releasing space out. So those are the types of activities that we're hearing anecdotally. And so I think that it's a little too early to tell, both on the travel pattern and also the impacts on the commercial market. But the early indications suggest that Broomfield is actually benefiting, and it's a terrible thing to say from COVID. I don't mean it quite that way, but economically, we've actually been able to gain from it a little bit, and that's a positive.
Thank you. And then next on the local economic trends, do those numbers, the projections of the forecasted 2023 numbers, do those include developments, both residential and commercial, that are in the pipeline at some point, or are those things that are only set and done?
Those are things that are, council member, those are things that are in the pipeline. Part of the budgeting process that Brenda follows is she works very closely with Anna to determine where we think the building permits are and which ones are going to come forward. And so, as you can imagine, because of when the budget process was beginning, and I if you don't mind, I'm kind of filling in because the three of us had a relatively robust conversation. When we saw the housing prices change and interest rates starting to change, we wondered if we were going to see some slowdowns in some of those activities. The early indication was we weren't, because those were already in the process. And once you begin that construction, you're not stopping. And so we're waiting to see if there will be some slowdown in the housing market, but the commercial market, once you get your financing set, generally speaking, you continue with that project. And that's what we believe will continue to happen. So there's probably a gap where we're going to experience that change, and that we're watching is post, we'll call it SDP approval by you all, prior to building permit being issued. That's where we're going to start seeing perhaps that leg occur and possibly some projects moving back off. But at this point, we believe that the 2023 numbers are pretty solid.
Okay. And then on the sales and property tax levels that you project for the 1.5 million for 1 mil, 1.48 for 1.1% of sales tax. What are those based on? Are those based on current projected sales tax?
Those are based upon the current base. So the property tax levels that we're currently at and what our collections are compared to our mills. And the same thing is true for the sales tax. So obviously, if we increase the base on the retail on sales, then those would generate more. That 0.1% would generate a higher level of revenue. And obviously our property taxes, if the valuations go up and the number of projects become higher. So if we'll say our total assessed values go up by 10%, then that would go up by 10% also. But that gives you what they are right now.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I just have two questions on capital projects. One was, I just noticed something. Sorry, I gotta find the page again. On the capital improvement projects that we had listed. I don't see it. Anyway, it said that the Midway multimodal plan, it had listed 500,000. And I was wondering what that includes and what, because my understanding is the Midway multimodal plan is going to be a much more extensive project. And it seemed 500,000 seemed low for that.
Ms. Allen? Thank you for the question, because we would hate to have Katie give up her evening of vacation and not actually answer a question.
No, I'm fine with not answering questions. Councilmember Marshall, that is the grant for the study itself.
Okay.
It doesn't have construction.
That makes sense. Thank you. And then the final question on the debt. We're currently sitting at about 1 year's revenue. Is that correct? And our total debt, we've got 490 million.
That's correct.
What's the ideal amount as far as like Moody's and credit rating, all this stuff? Because if we look at the possible capital projects at $231 million, if we as a council move forward with all of those and the voters approved all of them, then we're basically increasing our total debt by half. What's the ideal amount that we're looking for or shouldn't go above?
That's a great question. And we'd have to refer back to what I can't off the top of our debt policy recommendations are. So I'd have to go back and look at that, and I can get you what that capacity is. Again, the capacity would be set forth by council, but we can certainly say what's best recommended, again, in terms of that, taking on that additional debt, but I don't have that standard number, if you will.
We haven't put each one of those through individually nor collectively when we put them all on that sheet. But we will definitely do that.
That is all I have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Cohen.
Thank you, Mayor Tim. I want to follow up on what Councilmember Marshallson started because I wanted to basically comment, and don't take this as the wrong way, but I think I've heard this budget presentation several times before with the same numbers. But what I don't see is the strategy or the options to move forward. And I would love to see the next time we meet about this is put things in context like we just talked about. You know, I think it said that our debt service was 7.3%. Is that good? Should it be something else? If our debt ratio is 1-to-1, is that good? Is that where everybody else is? I would love to see some comparison with us and our similar communities or surrounding communities on growth, on debt, on commercial growth or a rate of commerce, residential growth, taxes, so we can put ourselves in context of where we are in the realm of should we be concerned about our debt service, concerned about our debt ratio, concerned about our growth rate. How do we compare so we can have some way of judging these rather than these are just a lot of numbers. After a while, it's just a lot of numbers. And I don't know how to deal with them or how to develop a strategy to either improve or change them. And, you know, in the marketing world, it's KPIs. So what are our KPIs? Where do we want to be? And realistically, we also need projections as best you can. I know obviously First Bank, the projection wasn't right, but where in 2030 do we think we should be and what's the projection to get there? So we know whether we need to change our strategy on approving residential, our strategy on taxes, our strategy on debt service. I think that putting things in that kind of context would be really helpful to me and maybe to other members of council, because otherwise I'm just getting snowed under in numbers. One thing I wanted to comment real quickly that did stand out in this presentation was the fact we haven't adjusted most of our taxes in 20 years. Reminded me that this is the 30th anniversary of Tabor. And 30 years ago, the voters approved a very restrictive tax proposal that basically can be summed up as in community decline. When Colorado approved that, Colorado ranked in the 20s or low 30s and all sorts of social measures. And since Tabor passed, we have sunk to the bottom of 48, 49, 50th. When you look at public health, when you look at teacher salaries, teacher funding, higher education funding, highway funding, we just sank to the bottom. One of the most striking statistics out of Tabor is immunizations in this state plummeted after Tabor was passed because public health was cut. So there's real costs to not keeping pace with taxes and the demand for services in the community. So it would be interesting to see, one, if we had maintained the same indexing of taxes over the years as our neighbors had, what kind of reserves would we have today? What kind of financial situation would we have been in if we had just kept pace rather than holding the line and keeping taxes, the property taxes down? As we know, the water tax rates have been kept flat for the most part. And now to Manager Hoffman's comment, the bill is coming due because we're approaching full build out. And I know to add on to that, it'd be also to add to the strategy question, what things do we need to plan for at full build out? How do things change when we're not at 80%, but we're at 100%, and that's our future? So there was a suggestion in the future discussions. One last comment to follow up. You've already had a couple of questions about First Bank, and I thought I heard the answer. Do we have any leverage over operators other than this upcoming agreement renewal? Because this is just anecdotal, but it seems like it's collecting dust over there and has for several years, and they have no interest of doing anything else because they obviously have no incentive to raise revenue for it. So I don't know if we have any other that we just have to wait. That's our only choice, or do we have any other choices?
Part of this is geared towards an executive session because of the current operator agreement on what some of those choices are and where it's located. So that's all I'm going to say on that right now.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in and say, you know, just for everyone, just to reiterate that we are going to have an executive session, it sounds like, but at least a study session on the First Bank Center and its use sometime, hopefully in the near future. So you guys keep that in mind with our comments tonight. And great comments also on context. That is, context is key. Anyways, Councilmember Lim.
Thank you. On the capital improvements projects long-range plan, where it lists the 5-year plan summary from actual 2021 to 2027 plan. There's a general trend that in 2027, all the categories, or at least a majority of the categories, have a large proportional increase in expenditures. That, at least that's what I observed in 2027. Can you explain that general trend? I mean, is there something magic about what's going to happen in 2027 that, like we've been talking about, well, you know, the bigger context, the numbers, the expenditures look exceptionally big in 2027. Is that just because that's as far out as we're projecting and we're dumping things in there that we really are thinking about in the future?
Ms. Ritchie? You can call upon Ms. Allen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I'll tag team with Ms. Allen. So I can start with that. So in terms of, it's a twofold. I think I would agree with your observation that in terms of planning what we project out, we want to keep it on the horizon, but not sure, one, on the costing element and whether or not where it fits in the overall plan, but we know within the next 5 years, so that could be a possibility. The other aspect in terms of a large number of those projects are related to transportation, and transportation projects tend to be a much higher capital cost is what we're seeing in those areas. So I can take mention there. I don't know if Ms. Allen has anything else to add to it. Nope.
Are you, sorry, are you referencing a certain page in the 5-year plan or a
I'm
certain slide?
referencing the 2023 capital improvements projects long-range plan. It's a link off of our memo, and it lists 2022 to 2027 CIP 5-year plan summary.
It's hard to analyze all the pages on the fly. Is that something we could get back to you on? There's no secret. I mean, we have 2027 is one of the funding years. The beyond 5-year plan is where a lot of them are jump up because that is the future. But I can look at 2027 offline and get back to you if
Okay.
there's anything specific.
Okay, thank you. I had a question about a funding source that's been in the news. So Broomfield is one of the counties that will get sales tax money from the Broncos sale. And although our amount of funding is proportional, it's to our contribution to the sales tax, I was just wondering if you had any idea at all how much our proportion was going to be. I know it's also geared towards youth activity programs. Can we use that for general parks and recreation funding?
We don't know. We don't know any of that yet. So when the Broomfield is with 16 other counties, and a whole host of about 35 cities that are in a special recreation district. So when the district was created, which is why we get the Rockies tickets, is because of that participation in that recreational district. So we don't have any additional information on what that distribution looks like, what the requirements are, and or timing. I think we were all surprised, quite frankly, when we saw Broomfield listed as one of the beneficiaries of those funds. So as soon as we know, we'll let council know.
Yeah, that would be not, I mean, if we can use it more generally for parks and recreation, I mean, I think that would apply to what counts, perhaps what I'm seeing Councilmember Lindsted stating is his disappointment with part of what the ARPA funding is not going to, was what flashed through my mind. How does the energy performance contract results, how do those results go in, feed into the budget that we're looking at right now? Because we've been discussing the EPC in ACES, and those results will be coming forward, I guess, to council shortly in general. And I'm not seeing it reflected in the budget yet. How will that interface?
I'm going to have Ms. Ritchie talk a little bit about that. Part of when we look at the additional projects that could be funded or at least accelerated, Councilmember Lim, what Councilmember Lim is referring to, an energy audit that was conducted. The legislation said that all folks need to have an energy audit done. There wasn't specificity, again, kind of another unfunded mandate. So do your energy audit. Third party came and did the energy audit, and it is looking at city-owned facilities that are over 50,000 feet, square foot. What the application of those findings are, they came back with a recommended $13 million to green those 5 buildings. So I believe Councilmember Lim's question is of that. So staff scrubbed that list. Part of, and it gets a little bit back to the ARPA funding, is capitalizing on existing CIP projects to further utilize those dollars that are already in the budget to then add value to either the scope or the time frame in order to get those completed. So of that 3 million recommended, Ms. Ritchie, how would that be included, and or would that be an additional conversation from a prioritization or reallocation perspective based on what's in the 2023 budget now? Those are part of the discipline and difficult conversations to be able to say, when we have something that occurs after the budget has been set and or revised, we come back to council 4 times throughout the year with revisions. Part of those revisions fall under categories that aren't in the base budget. That $3 million was not included in the base budget. So again, it would be coming back to council. Ms. Ritchie can talk about the timing and the integration of the prioritizing and reallocation of those funds. So what pulls in order to have that happen, and or what is lessened in order to make that happen? Ms. Ritchie.
Ms. Hoffman, you summarized that quite well. So just to add on that, so as Ms. Hoffman indicated, because over 600 pages of developing the budget takes a bit of a process, and unfortunately it's quite manual at this point. And we start very early on in the year. So as we move forward, not having those results as of yet, what we would do again is identify that, reallocate as we move forward with our first amendment related to the CIP rollover, depending on how that came into play with the existing projects and associated funding. I will say some of the recommendations that came from that had associated additional debt and financing recommendations, which was something at the time as we were developing the budget, did not have the capacity to evaluate, properly put it through our debt policy at standards and determine how we would move forward. So as Ms. Hoffman indicated, what we'll do is go back, evaluate them against holistically all of our CIP projects, and then determine, have that discussion with council as we move forward in terms of where that priority is in a future budget amendment.
Okay, that's good. I mean, the idea of the energy performance contract is done through the state and the third party was that it's eventually revenue positive because of the energy cost savings. But I mean, not immediately is the issue. Okay.
And Councilmember Blim, if I may, and this this gets a little bit to what Councilmember Cohen was asking. So if we look at apples to apples with the other communities, all of the other communities around us, they did not, their approach was not a cash in lieu for a long period of time. Their approach historically has been when they want big ticket capital improvement, whether it's a rec center or streets, they go to their community and say, how important is this? Whether it's a mill levy increase or a sales tax increase. So essentially what Broomfield Council is talking about right now is common practice with other communities of prioritizing capital related projects. To your question, Councilmember Lim, it falls into that same category. Jake, if you can go to slide 15 on the possible capital projects. When we look at sustainability, the accelerating CCOB sustainable infrastructure, and then we specifically note the energy audit. Part of that energy audit with that third party is the third party identifies the buildings and the requests, so the 13 million, and that third party also finances what those improvements look like. So it's debt, but it's off of the books debt, but it's debt nonetheless. So even when you're looking at the repayment, we just got solar at our at our house, and again, the cost benefit ratio, part of the cost benefit ratio is for climate impact. So you have to do how much is the contribution to the climate impact and the finances, right? So it's not just a matrix of kind of that straight across the board. So big ticket funding CIPs, if we start working on a practice of reviewing those capital projects through what's important to the community, then they decide what the priority levels are, rather than, to Councilmember Cohen's point, of maintaining the sales tax rate and the surrounding property tax, the mill levies that are attached to each one of those.
Thank you. Well, I'll look forward to that coming forward then at some point in a further review with the staff and with ACE's conversation probably too. Two specific items. And there's still an item in 2022 for 136th Avenue and Aspen Street traffic signal. Is that still happening in 2022? Well, that sounds like a Katie Allen.
Yes, we're out for bid right now.
Okay, great, thanks. And there's in 2027, there's an item for recreational improvements to the Broomfield Reservoir. of $300,000. I thought we weren't doing recreational improvements to the Broomfield Reservoir.
Where's Miss Allen? We're just gonna keep, you might as well just stand up there. Miss Allen.
I think that's not supposed to be in there. I think it was a project put on a long time ago in a very out year, and 20
Okay.
years later, we're there.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Lynn. Councilmember Ward.
All right, thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So my first question is going to be in regards to the outstanding debt we still have for the First Bank Center. Has staff started to identify whether or not they want to start putting away money for that balloon payment? Or are you waiting more for our study session and executive session we have to see what council's decision and how we move forward is with that project?
Well, we don't have a choice about that balloon payment, which is complicated by the fact that since that area hasn't been able to pay for itself, the 36 million that we took from the 120th URA to pay that, it's a ripple effect. So even though it's going from URA to URA, when we need improvements on 120th, if there's not money in the 120th urban renewal area, then that comes out of the general fund URA. With regards to that balloon payment, we are absolutely having to put dollars away so that we make that balloon payment. So again, it means, so what's not happening in order to make sure that we're saving up for that $10 million. So again, each one of these it's a domino effect.
Okay. And then I guess more in general for kind of, I guess, a debt policy. Are you looking more for direction on that, or is this part of a multi-step process when we really break down how we want to set up that debt policy? Because I am coming into this, I always thought this was the debt policy conversation and we would kind of be hashing that out here, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm just curious on that.
So we're thinking of this, and thanks for the question, Councilmember Ward. This is the again, culmination of, since January, every council meeting has kind of built on the next one. So it's important for council to understand kind of, so we've been through the financing 101, 102, 201. Then we went through the development, and then we went through the residential, and then we went through the commercial. Now we're doing the high level debt, and then we start drilling down. So this is the 30,000 foot. As we move forward on, kind of back to Councilmember Cohen's, is there a sweet spot? And not just from the surrounding communities, right? Because again, we know that the biggest difference is between the sales tax and the mill levy rates. When we're comparing apples and apples, and we try not to, because when you call out communities that we feel are healthy and strong, what their sales tax is and what their mill levies are, the flip side of that is there's going to be plenty of communities that we don't want to call those out, right? We want to be able to say, here's a good example of communities that do it right, but we don't want to say, here's communities that have a high tax rate and high mill levies, and PS, they don't do it right, or their water infrastructure, right? So we need to be really mindful when we're doing those comparisons to community to find that sweet spot. Kind of what Councilmember Leslie has been talking about is kind of the standard blueprint, right? What is not just best practices, But from the Moody's, when you have X amount, regardless of where your other communities are, in order to maintain AAA rating, what is the ratio between your revenue and your outstanding, right? Those are numbers that when we come back on these debt conversations, we have those numbers, but again, we wanted to keep it at a 30,000 foot. Otherwise we'd be here until 1 a.m. On the First Bank Center, it's less about the debt ratio and it's more about the what's next. Because we know we have $51 million. Nobody's going to come and write us a $51 million check. And we know that it's going to continue to be a struggle. Whether it's the existing operator or whether it's repurposed.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess my last question I'm going to have is when we do these capital investment projects, how much do we factor in grants and other, I guess, government funds, whether they be state, federal, et cetera, into this debt conversation? If that makes any sense.
Tell me, say it one more time.
So how do we, from a debt policy perspective, when we look at how much are we going to be contributing from a debt perspective, how does grants from like the federal government or the state government factor into that? Because I think one of the perceptions people might have is that certain areas like transportation, for example, tend to be, I think, more reliant on grants from higher levels of government. And how do we factor that into our debt policy? Or should we be looking at changing that? That's kind of what I'm trying to get at.
We do to a certain degree, and to that degree, Councilmember Lindstedt is and Councilmember Schaaf probably the most familiar with the pots of money that come and tip, right? And so it's very competitive. So by the time it gets to the state of Colorado, it's called Senate Bill 1. I won't even go into all of the technicalities, but unless there are funds that are left over, that bucket doesn't get a lot of funds, right? And so to Councilmember Cohen's point about the Tabor and continuing to have to acclimate and become more and more reliant, because everything, especially now that everything is so exponentially more expensive. And as Miss Allen had indicated, that transportation is our largest nut to crack, if you will. So we absolutely take into account the federal funding and the state funding. Grant funding to a much lesser degree, because generally those require the match, and they're much less than kind of that ongoing subsidized federal spending amount. But yes, it's factored in, and that's really indicative, and that's what drives the timeline of these projects being either significantly delayed or partially, is because that mechanism to finance is so layered. And if you don't have, it's just like development, right? You have 8 different components. And if one of those components isn't factored in, then the whole thing falls. It's part and parcel of when we look at build out up north. And we continue to look at Highway 7 and 169th and Huron, right? And balancing that with all of the road improvements that we need in original Broomfield. Again, through that equity lens on those CIPs, it's we have to have that repeatable process.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I think my last question is going to be, if, for example, part of our debt conversation led to us being more reliant on Broomfield's own funds, and we raise that money through whatever mechanism is decided upon by this council and then subsequently the voters. Would we be able to, like, let's say we have a transportation project we want to fund, however, there is tip funding and there's grant money, et cetera, that we can be competitive with and receive, would we be able to transfer some of that like dedicated funds? Let's say you dedicated 100% of Broomfield's money to fund, say, just 120th improvement project, but we are able to receive 80, let's just for simplicity purposes, say 80% of that funding comes from tip. Could we allocate that, the money that we were going to, that 80% we ourselves are going to reallocate that to other projects, since I'm assuming that's under governmental funds and we're not transferring it to like a fiduciary fund or an enterprise fund?
So if I'm getting this right, so if your question is if we already have money programmed
Yes.
and we were able to go out and have a sales tax increase for transportation, would we reallocate those funds?
So let's say we have a sales tax and that's going to cover all transportation projects,
Okay,
but there is, and we're going to cover that 100%. So we don't need to get grant money, but if that grant money were to become available and we received it, could we then transfer whatever we were going to pay over into something else, like let's say facilities maintenance or recreation, whatever?
that'll take additional, I don't want to say yes or no, because it depends on the grant. It depends on what it's for. It depends on, there's a lot of variables.
Okay. I saw, that's all. Thank you.
Maybe. Any additional questions from council? Well, thanks again to the staff for the great presentation. The only thing that not really a question, but that just caught my attention, some of it was based on Councilmember Cohen's comments, and then also looking at that page 15. And I think just next time when we are talking, sounds like we may be doing this anyways, but just next time we're talking about our, possible capital projects, and when we're doing some priority decision-making, it really would just be good to have, simple analysis of, number one, what do we want? And then number two, what can we afford? I think that's where it's always gets kind of at least vague for me and maybe some of my colleagues as well. So having that, and that means based on current revenues, based on, what's our bond capacity, based on, do we have any flexibility with an additional sales tax or property tax? But, being able to understand, exactly, okay, these are the different things that we want. That's great. If we can't do them all, what is the capacity, and, what are the different, mechanisms to get to that capacity? So I
That's
think,
fair.
and I'm hoping and guessing, sound like from some of your comments that maybe that is on the horizon, but, I think that's, sort of, make it simple and to understand and digest that, here's what we want, here's what we can afford. This is what you need to do to afford it. And I mean, that's what's, I think we all do on a daily basis, but and being able to sort of translate that into, very easy to understand, language and numbers would be, super helpful, going forward.
We'll do our best.
Thank you. All right, seeing no other questions, we are done with the first agenda item of the night. We're going to take a quick 10-minute break, as we customarily do, and we will resume at about, I don't know, 8:34-ish. Thanks. To get back on the record here and move forward with our second and final item of the evening. And that is a catalytic development briefing regarding Flatiron Crossing reinvestment. It's going to include market conditions and a project status update from Macerich. Council has a copy of the agenda memorandum. I am going to ask staff for a summary.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem, and Mr. Romine will introduce our partners from Macerich.
Thank you, Manager Hoffman, Mayor Pro Tem, Mayor, members of council. This is a great opportunity to give you a briefing. As you know, on the other two catalytic projects, you've had recent briefings. I mentioned that earlier. But tonight you get a real sense of where the project is moved already, both internally within the Flatiron's Crossing Mall and what they have been able to do there because of the commitment both between the city and Macerich as a company and what that's allowed them to do as far as leasing and attracting the types of tenants that we want. They'll also give you an update tonight about where the redevelopment that to the southwest of the existing mall facility and what that process is looking like and that some of the timelines that they're already achieving. As a final note, just as a hint, again, as you may recall, some of you who were on council previously when this item moved through council, and then for those who we briefed during your either runs or immediately after election, there are a number of milestones within our agreement with Macerich around this investment. And so they'll reference some of those also in the briefing. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob from Macerich, who will then introduce the rest of the team who are here to answer questions as well, make a presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, council members and Mayor Pro Tem. My name is Jacob Knutson with Macerich, owner of Flatiron Crossing Mall. We're happy to be here tonight to share some information with you. We have a couple statistics nationally that we'll talk about. I'll have my colleague Megan come up and share some information specific to the local market and Flatiron Crossing Mall specifically. And then we'll do a project refresh and a project update of specific to our village redevelopment project. So as we shared in the past, regional retail requires a significant investment and a significant annual reinvestment in order to stay relevant. We can't thank the city of Broomfield and its leadership enough for its partnership going back to the 1990s when the mall was initially planned and going through its design phases. Over the last 20 years, when we've seen the mall in its current form as a regional mall, and then looking forward to the next phase, the next chapter of the mall, transforming into a mixed-use regional town center that becomes more things to more people. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So we want to share a few statistics that we've come across from a national perspective. First, we're seeing mall traffic coming out of the pandemic increase in the suburban environments quicker than the urban environments. So mall traffic is back to 83% of pre-pandemic levels in suburban malls versus 73% in urban malls. Mall occupancy across our portfolio is at 91.8% today, which is the highest since Q3 of 2020. We've seen a 7% increase in sales year over year at shopping centers, which exceeds pre-pandemic levels. Nearly $100 billion has been spent on food and beverage year over year nationwide. In our portfolio, in 2021, we signed 3.5 million square feet of leases. That was the highest volume since 2015. And year to date, 2022, we're on par with that same volume. 840,000 square feet of that in 2021 was new to portfolio brands. And this is important when you read the news and you're seeing bankruptcies and all the other articles. Well, we're seeing these new tenants. A lot of it is bricks to mortar tenants. So it's traditionally online retailers that see the importance of brick and mortar stores coming to our properties. And that was 88 new tenants make up that 840,000 square feet. And then lastly, in 2021, we held 1,800 events at our portfolio nationwide. These were blood drives, movies in the park, concerts, cultural events, farmers markets, and that type of thing. Next slide, please. So a couple examples of redefining malls. similar projects that we're looking at doing as Flatiron Crossing elsewhere in our portfolio. Chandler Fashion Center, we're kind of re-envisioning what the outdoor village there looks like, transforming it into an entertainment and food and beverage district. And then in the bottom right, you see Washington Square Mall, which is a very similar property to Flatiron Crossing, where we're taking an old department store, demolishing it and building back a mixed-use town square with a movie theater, entertainment, hotel, apartments, and outdoor community park and that type of thing. Next slide, please. And then proven success of the formula that we're looking at here. Tyson's Corner Center in Virginia. We've invested $500 million there into mixed use redevelopment, which includes a Hyatt Regency hotel, a luxury residential, and a Class A office tower. And then we have additional redevelopment planned for additional luxury residential and office as well. Scottsdale Fashion Square, we converted a former Barney's department store box into industrious co-working and a flagship Apple store. We're also have a Caesars Republic Hotel under construction, and we're planning for additional office and luxury residential. And then Kierland Commons in Scottsdale, Arizona as well, looking at the opportunity to do luxury residential and office there. Next slide. I'm going to ask Megan to come up and speak to Flatiron specifically.
Hello, my name is Megan Kaltenstein. I'm on the leasing team at Macerich. Have been part of the Flatiron Crossing team for a little over 15 years. So I've seen kind of the evolution of the project, evolution of the market. It's been really kind of an interesting couple of years, to say the least. You know, traditionally Flatiron Crossing was the third area in which, you know, when retailers come to the market, they look at Cherry Creek, they look at Park Meadows, they look at Flatiron. We've always benefited from being an enclosed shopping center. Due to kind of the elements, you know, there's little shopping centers that are out parcels, but these have always been pretty solid centers. We have seen a shift over the last 2 years post-pandemic with some of the growth in the market and some of the retailers that have refocused their energy away from some of the larger coasts and a little more into the central regions of America. And with that, we've added a lot of new tenants over the last renewals and new tenants to Flatiron and 29th Street, which is also our sister property. So what we've seen, you know, with 29th Street being in Boulder and then Broomfield is 29th Street's definitely generating some of the digitally native brands that are looking to convert from online to bricks and mortar. And then the legacy tenants are the ones that are looking to open long-term locations at Flatiron Crossing. So what we've done is we've really been very intentional about separating the two assets to make sure that one serves a very specific demographic and we don't oversaturate a category. So we've been pleased with what we've seen and the response we've been getting in the Broomfield market, and especially with what's going to be online with the redevelopment. But I will say that between Denver and Boulder, we are seeing more and more retailers focused in that area because it's the one that they see the most growth and potential coming online.
All right, next slide, please. So starting to think specific to our village reinvestment project, you know, as we started to think about what this mall wanted to be, you know, the first thing we did was looked at the demand and the opportunity to transform it into a live, work, play, shop destination. We believe that there is demand for residential, office, and hotel in this market. And some interesting data here on a study of malls that CoStar did, where they're finding a premium in both office rents and residential rents for mixed use properties at US malls. Next slide. So I think this is one of the most important slides in the deck. And as we started thinking about what this property wanted to be and the community values and the project values, you know, we came up with these three keywords: thriving, sustainability, and inclusiveness. You know, thriving is really about the connectivity, the mix of uses, making it more things to more people, bringing the community together here. Sustainability, which is a huge corporate goal for Macerich. We have a corporate goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. And we're looking at ways to do that both operationally and you know, through construction of new projects. And then inclusiveness, you know, early in our conversations with the city and with council, we realized the importance of affordable and inclusive housing here, and we've committed to deliver that at the property. Next slide. So considering the program and the mixed use opportunity, obviously we have 1.2, 1.3 million square feet of retail existing today. And what do we want this to be? So we looked at multifamily residential, really making it a 24-hour use with residents living on site. The hotel, having new people flowing through nightly. Office, really increasing that daytime traffic opportunity, and that all creates a thriving community. Next slide, please. This slide looks at a day in the life for all of these people. What are people that come in and shop going to do? The music, the events, the dining, the entertainment, the professionals, the employees that work in the office building, which is very lunchtime focused, but spending time outside in the community plaza, games, music, food trucks. The residents, they're there overnight. In the morning, they get their cup of coffee. They take their kids down to the park or their dogs to the dog park, and the community. This is really for the entire community and not just the people that live and work on our property and how they'll engage in this environment. Next slide, please. So the top half of this slide shows the hours of activity, as it is today as a regional mall. Between 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., we have dining and shopping, and then that picks back up about 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. You have people back on campus dining and shopping. The bottom half shows the future after our village reinvestment, where you have the residents that are there overnight, the hotel guests that arrive in the evening and leave in the morning, the office workers that are there all day. And that creates a total campus environment of really the 24-hour mixed use environment that we're looking for. Next slide, please. And then we got into the demand. So, obviously we're right off the 36, centrally located between Denver and Boulder. The growth that we're seeing in both of those markets is leading to the growth and the opportunity here in Broomfield. So we've looked at multifamily with 1,200 units delivered over the past 5 years, and a strong pipeline coming. Office 867,000 square feet to be delivered by 2024 within a 2-mile radius. We looked at entertainment opportunity and the restaurant opportunity, where shoppers are and where they're spending and how much they're spending. Next slide, please. And then looking at the existing infrastructure and how we can play that into our opportunity. So this shows Flatiron Crossing Mall in yellow, and then the existing parks and open space in green within a small radius from our property. Next slide. And then looking at the regional infrastructure. So obviously you have the 36 freeway situated right to the north of our property, and then the vehicular connectivity around and through the property. Next slide. And then this is a big one, obviously, when we're talking about multimodal transportation with the pedestrian and the hiking trails and the bike trails that are in and around our property. Next slide. And then zooming in, and this does overlay our village redevelopment project there. So talking about the vehicular connectivity to and through the project, including the village reinvestment. Next slide. And then the trail systems connecting to and through our property, including through the village reinvestment project. Next slide. And then quickly, I know a lot of you have seen this in the past, but quickly getting through kind of the open space in our programming here, we identified 4 key areas within the project. Next slide. First one being the hub. This is the space that's right outside of the existing food court, where we see this being a daytime place for all. This is where it's going to be very kid friendly. We're looking at doing a kids play area, outdoor seating that can play off the mall food court. Next slide. The yard is the main focal space. So this is the 2.5 acre park that we're programming right at the center of the project. And this is really the gathering place. This will be the games. This will be the programmed events. We can flip through the next few slides here that show some examples. Movies on the lawn. Go ahead. Farmers markets. Holiday markets and Winterfest. Fitness on the lawn. Water slides and Summerfest. Who doesn't want that? And then to the south of the residential building, we have a smaller opportunity that we're calling the social retreat. This is the space that you'll meet your friends and have a glass of wine in a quieter area. Still relative to the park, but a quieter area off to the side. Next slide. And then lastly, the bonfire. So this is right outside of the existing AMC. We'll have a more intimate opportunity, again, with your friends, whether you're waiting for a movie or you want a quieter space that's kind of away from the park and the hustle and bustle. Next slide. That all leads to the goal of a community gathering place. You know, really the reason for the 24-hour day and the outdoor community that we're creating here is to bring the community together. That's both the office workers that are there during the day, the residents at night, and the community that's visiting, we hope, frequently. Next slide. I won't go into detail on this, but this was from our architect, and this is really creating about the sense of place, both from the arrival sequence, how you work to and through the space, and what you'll do when you're spending time there. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, Macerich is an industry leader in sustainability. We have the goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. 13 properties with solar. That includes Flatiron Crossing. We have over 2 acres of solar on this site. We have some LEED certifications. We have electric vehicles at, I think, 36 of our properties, and looking to expand that as well. And these are all things that we're thinking about and we're programming as we look at the design of our village reinvestment project. Next slide. Green transportation. So there's the 267 vehicle charging stations at 31 properties today. Next slide. And then lastly here, this is connecting with the community. So we have created an app that you can install on your phone. And as you walk through the mall, this is targeted. It can give you information about events. We partner with our retailers to inform customers about sales and other things going on at the property. And this is something unique that's proprietary to Macerich that we created. Next slide. All of this, is being done to elevate the shopper engagement, experiential fitness events, and dining. Next slide. So lastly, getting specific into our progress with the village redevelopment. So identified there in the pinkish purple is the 25 or so acres that we're talking about here. We have made a lot of great progress on design over the past handful of months. We have submitted our demo application, and we're looking to begin demo next month. That'll be a first phase of demo that'll be complete before the holidays, so that holiday customer traffic's not competing with construction traffic. You'll see our SDP package coming in before the end of the year, likely in November, and we'll be looking to start full construction early next year. Next slide. I think everybody's aware, but as a quick recap, the first phase includes the 2.5 acre park. It includes the first phase of residential on the left that's programmed to be about 311 units. We do have our residential partner selected. Cannot publicly say who that is. We're still working through the documentation, but expect to be able to announce that fairly soon. And then you see the first phase of office to the right. That'll be 150 to 250,000 square feet, dependent on demand. Next slide. And there's the pretty picture to end it off with. So that's all I have. Thank you. And we look forward to any questions.
Well, do appreciate the brief and concise presentation. And I know we did, you were in front of us not too long ago, if I recall. I think it's been within the last year, most definitely. So it's good to get the status update of where you are, where you are right now and where things are going. So with that, we'll take any questions from council. Start with Councilmember Henkel.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and Bill's fan. And apparently I forgot my athletic gear tonight. So thank you for being here. All of this looks beautiful, and I will be the first in line for that water slide.
I'll see you there.
To heck with all the other residents. I'm coming in. No, this looks really beautiful, and I appreciate the revitalization. We've seen so many times where malls are not revitalized, or the city and county do not want to take the time or effort to really, or perhaps they just don't have the funding to do it. So I'm thankful that Broomfield is stepping forward alongside you all. I just have 2 questions, probably one for you and then one for staff. I believe from what I was reading, I forgot my computer tonight. With the affordable housing, what does that look like? I believe it was 80% AMI, and it's how many units? And then explain that just a little bit further.
Yeah, so we've committed to 20% of the units at 80% AMI. At 600 units, that's 120 affordable.
Okay.
And then staff, is that the minimum requirements of where our ordinance stands?
Our ordinance is 60% of AMI. So
Okay.
through the negotiations, kind of the back and forth, a lot of the developers, it's expensive to build those units. And so as we, through 4 iterations going back and forth with these partners and really pushing that envelope to say it's critical for us to have the units. And so I don't know how many iterations it was as I look out there, but it was several for them to, again, I don't want to say acquiesce, but essentially that's just exactly what they did. And so again, it's give and give. So we gave on the 60%, went to the 80%, and they delivered the full number of units.
Okay. Will our discussion on housing soon affect this? If so, are they going to be, asking for a variance? Is that the approach?
The conversation, and I'll have Mr. Romine come up. The conversation that we're having on the IHO is about the cash in lieu. So for developers that choose the cash in lieu, we are going to be phasing that in. And no, this, given that they're providing the units, that will not be part of their conversation. Mr. Romine?
And Manager Hoffman is precisely correct. The agreement's already been in place for the 80% AMI, 20% of the units. So that part has already been fixed. And part of it is we felt it was critically important that the units be provided on site. So at one point there was some conversation about doing it offsite or doing a cash in lieu. But we felt that it was important that they were on the site here. So that was part of our negotiation is they must be in. Secondly, Jacob and team will be making an introduction with us to the housing vertical developer, at which point we can have a conversation about potentially buying down some additional affordability or increasing the units. We don't know if that's going to be part of the conversation yet, but we have suggested throughout our discussion with Macerich that that's something that we'd like to talk to directly with a vertical developer. So we don't know if it will result in further affordability or additional units, but we wanted to have that direct conversation also.
Okay. This might be sort of an off the wall question, and I don't know if we have an answer for this. One of my biggest concerns, okay, my husband's Republican, I'm Democrat. One of our biggest conversations about this is he's like, we need to engage our commercial developers in affordable housing. And he's like, we do not tap into our commercial development, as far as the businesses being there. How much ownership did they have a part? Like, we know we have leasing of the places, but are we engaging you had mentioned where we have a lot of online companies coming in and they want now brick and mortar. Are we having any conversations with people that we're bringing in to be a part of the affordable housing conversation?
Mayor Pro Tem, members of council, Councilmember Henkel, that is something that we have started the engagement of in talking to a number of businesses where they have expressed a concern about the housing accessibility and the ability to attract workforce in a reliable manner. Part of this whole conversation is you hate to take one element out and say this is a housing conversation or this is a workforce conversation. It really is all three, and the third part of that stool is transportation. So if our transportation choices aren't there, then we're in a different situation than if we do have a good, strong transportation system. It is something that we intend to engage with, and I know that Broomfield Housing Alliance has started those conversations also and is looking to think about how can they engage the philanthropic community as well as the business community into supporting of income-aligned housing. So it's not, we haven't fully engaged it, but part of this is Macerich is a commercial developer, and so we have begun that conversation through this type of project, as well as with our other catalytic developments, to say these things need to fit together. They can't be one-offs and separated.
Mhm.
we haven't gone further than that, but that's something that we continue to work toward.
Okay. One of the things, just so that the developer knows, that a lot of times we'll see developments come in and there is a segmented portion of affordable housing, like just over here is where affordable housing is. Or it's just one bedroom studios, that's the affordable housing. What is this diversity of housing going to look like? Do we have any
In
idea?
this particular project, which is what we'll reinforce when we have the conversations with the vertical developer, is it must be mixed in and it must match the same look, meaning that if there's, we'll call it 50% two bedrooms and 50% ones, then it will be that same degree of mix within the affordable units. So that it really is so that you cannot be identified specific, like it's the third floor in this building or this building. And so it really is to be integrated in. And that's been a principle of our program and continues to be part of what we have the conversation with every developer around is it must be integrated as best as we can in these projects.
Yeah, and I see all these activities, they're family activities. So I know we have a lot of families really, really in need of affordable housing. I work with our refugee task force, and our refugees are like families of 9, and they're making $2,000 and their rent is $2,800 a month. And they would be fabulous to our workforce. Anyway, that's sort of a side note, but I will say that we need more diversity. If we can swing 60% at a certain point, that would be on my wish list. So
It is, and as the council members were, when we had the executive sessions and we had these conversations, as some of you may recall, we talked about all the wants that we had, and we went through and made sure that we pushed on every one of those points. But in the end, we wanted to make sure that we got a very, very strong, viable project on both sides. We don't give up. We keep working, and that's part of the conversation we're looking forward to with the vertical developer.
great, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Holshin.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. I just have 3 quick questions for the developer. I just want to say that I love this project, especially the fact that you're taking giant surface level parking lots and turning them into something sustainable and multi-use. But that's my first question. So I know that we're talking about the southern side, but on the northern side of the property, there's still giant surface level parking lots. Do you have any long-term plans to do anything different with those? How often are those lots full? I guess, is that the best use of space?
Yeah, I think that, over time, I think we do see future phases, based on the success that we see coming out of this project. I think there's opportunity for future phases. As to the parking today, I mean, obviously Nordstrom box is vacant. Nordstrom vacated in 2020 and we've repurchased that. We're exploring transforming that to Class A office. So today that lot is vacant. But once occupied, we'd expect the majority of that lot to be full. Then across the property, I mean, these regional malls were built with these anchors with Macy's and Dillard's that come in, and they're really built for that holiday traffic. And during the holidays, that side is full.
Okay. And then on the office space, are you seeing any changes we've talked about it in our last conversation, the changes in the workforce as far as remote versus in the office space? Are you seeing any issues with filling those office spaces? And then in conjunction with that, are you building shared workspace for the residents to be able to use if they don't want to work, if they work from home, but they don't necessarily want to work in their home?
Yeah, so in the residential building there, we're early in the design there, but there will likely be kind of co-working spaces that are built in, common co-working spaces that the residents can use. As far as the Nordstrom building, so we have a broker that is actively marketing the space. And really what we're seeing is a flight to quality. So if you build it and you build it right, there are many active requirements out there in the 30 to 40 plus thousand square feet range that we're actively talking to. A lot of the companies are downsizing. A lot of companies are going to a hybrid work model. But at the end of the day, what we're hearing is they want their employees back in the office, whether it's full-time or part-time. And we're very confident on our side to be able to lease that space.
Thank you. And then one final question on, really appreciate your commitment to sustainability and like EV charging and all that thing. Just out of curiosity, and this is just kind of for my own information and for future discussions, you have at the current location, you have level 3 chargers and they're branded by a particular company. Who pays to put those in? Do you as the developer have to pay to put that in, or does the company like Electrify America or whoever, do they pay part of that installation cost?
Each deal is different, and I don't know about Flatiron specifically. I don't know if either of you know, but each deal is different. In some, we're required to provide the power, and then they come in and install, their equipment. And in some instances, we're paying for the whole thing. So each deal is different.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Chef.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. So thank you to Macerich for your continued interest in your investment here in Broomfield. This is a great looking project, and I think this is something that, will really activate that space. And what we've heard from our residents is, man, the mall looks like it's dying. And I think that this is one of those things that's kind of like that shot in the arm, to really re-energize both the space, not that it's not doing well, but also to the residents' perception that this is doing really well. And I think that that's going to be great for the entire community. Thank you to staff for your continued work and conversations with this project. It seems like it's headed in the right direction. So kind of to our previous conversation, when we're looking at the totality of expenses and costs associated with the project, have we looked at what kind of FTEs are going to be required to support this project? What kind of infrastructure is going to be needed? There's already, I believe, a substation out there for our police department. I don't know if that's the exact right word. Is that going to need to be expanded out there? A greater presence from our police department? So what kind of additional infrastructure, additional expenses are going to be needed to support this project?
Appreciate that question, Councilmember Schaff. And as we talked before, from a package perspective, one of the differences between Broomfield Town Square and this development is, although they're in our house, we are not, it's not our land. So that's part of the difference from when we talk about FTEs. So really that development is a standalone development where our service level has additional conversations is Mr. Romine and Ms. Ritchie with that model, that financial model that we have been using to be able to say, this is the portion of revenue that is generated by each resident, and this is the service level costs for each residence. So yes, Jeff has done that, that revenue model. Jeff, anything else to add on that?
No, the only thing I would do is just say that when we did the waterfall of revenue, so the sales tax revenue, property tax, we thought about the bond obligation that we had because of the former support that we provided that was in a bond. We then looked at what those expenses were going to be based upon that model. So we recognized it was 600 residents, residential units, which would roughly equal about 1,000 persons, what that expense would be. So there will be some additional expenses related to it, but that's part of the operational cost. So obviously there'll be slightly more police calls as an example, people utilizing the library and coming and doing that. So that's incorporated within the model. The one other item I would just note is as part of the demolition that Jacob had referenced, is causing some of those buildings to come down. And so there will be eventually a different police location. So that substation is moving, and that's part of the discussion that we've had. And it's part of what has been incorporated into the thought process. So some of those things are fully incorporated within the incentive, and as we work through what those revenue implications would be. So they were incorporated, yes.
Perfect, thank you. So, a couple of things. One of the kind of, I wouldn't say cornerstones, but one of the unique things that is happening now within malls and with kind of retail developments, and Flatiron Crossing does a great job of this, is kind of those Instagrammable moments that they have sprinkled in throughout. So I'm hoping that those continue in these new redeveloped areas, and that's kind of a new thing. I would say, pickleball is a big thing, in these areas. So I don't know if that's something on your list of items that you're going to include. And then of course, a big slide is always intriguing to keep, little kids engaged and parents hanging around the mall for that much longer. One of the questions that I had was around there were a couple of pictures around micro transit and transit. And could you talk a little bit about how you envision micro transit being used in this area with that many more residents, with that many more kind of office spaces? I imagine, electric bikes, scooters could be utilized in this area, and how are those going to be managed?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely something that we're thinking about. Again, we're kind of early in the design process on that and really thinking about the spaces in the buildings and soon to get into more of the details like that. But we'll absolutely be connecting to the regional infrastructure. That was kind of the point of showing the regional infrastructure that's in place and then how we're thinking about connecting that to and through our project. We're thinking about things like bike lockers. We want to be on the path when people are coming down from Boulder. We want them to stop and, feel comfortable leaving their bike while they go get a beer or whatever it might be. But yeah, absolutely on the forefront of our mind and something that we'll continue to advance.
That's great to hear. I think that, this could definitely be a hub for that micro transit within the region. So I'm glad to hear that.
And Councilmember, if I can build on that, and Councilmember Ward may want to add also, or Councilmember Lindstedt, because we've had conversations. As you may or may not know, there is something called the FID over there, which is the Flatirons Improvement District. There is a small amount of sales tax that's being collected and has been collected. That FID is for transportation. And so that's what we're looking at now. And we're going to have a retreat meeting of the FID board, which Councilmember Ward is part of, where we're going to be talking about micro transit. We've already had a conversation with the mall manager, Kate, and talked about whether we could implement it even faster. So is it something we could bring forward in 2023? And we have money in that account in that district, and something that we'd like to do now, not even wait for the full redevelopment to occur. So that's something that's on the immediate horizon. And Councilmember, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I don't really have anything else to add to that. Jeff pretty much summed it up pretty well. We will be talking about whether we want to use like electric scooters, e-bikes, have them free roaming like Lime does, or do more like fixed stations like Boulder Bike Share has, or expanded transit service. There's all sorts of things we have options to discuss, but that will be happening in October, and we should hopefully have something pinned down by then.
Awesome. Thanks for those conversations. That's all I have, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. Councilmember Lim.
Yes, we've discussed the Flatirons Mall as a regional draw for the commercial aspect of it. How do you see the draw for the residential? Do you see a lot of people who were not previously attracted to live in Broomfield to decide to move to Broomfield because of the housing in Flatirons Mall? Or do you see in your prognosis people from Broomfield in other places deciding to move to Flatirons Mall? I just don't know if you've looked at that.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both. We're really creating an urban walkable environment that doesn't exist today in a suburban environment, right? We're also going to be at a discount when you look at rents from both Boulder and downtown Denver. So there are people that are going to want to live in that environment, may not necessarily be able to afford it in Denver, that are going to want to come here. And I think, there's some young professionals and others that do live in Broomfield and for whatever reason, haven't moved to downtown Denver or Boulder and will want to live here. So I think it's both.
Okay, good. Thank you. I was thinking about that related to the creating the community as to how that would work. I went back to listen to our conversation in October of 21 when we approved the PUD amendment and thought, well, the economy is a little different now. At least the uncertainty. So we had great in reviewing that conversation, there was great confidence, I would say, expressed by staff that we had the right milestones in place. We had the right triggers, as you were just talking about. And you were very happy that we had our revenue contribution capped at 25% of our sales revenue, so that we were guaranteed not to exceed our revenue and required contributions and all that. So I guess because it is a little different economy now, I just wanted staff to take a minute and say, is everything still set in that agreement as you would want it to be if you had to redo it today?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
Sure.
And And when I was re-listening to that discussion also, you were very pleased at the cooperation of the developer. Do you find that kind of cooperation unusual that you had with this developer?
I think it was an environment of part of it, Councilmember Lim, being just naive enough to not know what no meant. And continuing to go back to that drawing board and push. And so I don't think it was necessarily surprised because I can't miss something I haven't had before. What I can tell you is the application for lessons learned of what has happened before, which that's what gives me confidence to be able to say, if we were to do that deal again today, it would look just like the deal that we did then, simply because it was a give and take. It was again, to say that there weren't tense times and kind of knocking it around, particularly with the affordable units and with the trail connections, with the amount of open space and green, with the limited up on the script for that last category for the Flatiron crossing perspective. Again, it was a little bit different, Councilmember Lim, because this is Broomfield's economic driver. That development has been something that has allowed us to be who and what we are. So again, they had a lot of leverage as well, to be able to come back and say, yeah, no, we're not going to roll that $25 million debt that you all should have paid, but you didn't, into our overall debt package, but they did. So from that perspective, yes, we're confident that it's and having built-in triggers is key, because if the external environment doesn't produce what we're anticipating it to produce, then both of us are still all in. There isn't one that is participating or expecting something else. And that's why the update tonight was primarily to say demolition is, you're seeing it come to fruition. So instead of, and all the great pictures, and they are great pictures and everybody loves to see great pictures. What we didn't want to happen on this development was to see great pictures one year and then have the economy be doing something outside of our control and then see a different picture the following year. And that isn't the case. So to Councilmember Schaaf's point, if you go to, so when we're applying apples to apples, the categories that are on the left-hand side through which all developments will pass through, so we can have a well-informed decision from the acreage perspective, the number of units, the affordable, the aligned, and then kind of what that trade-off is, so we can kind of say, what kind of deal is this? And then council makes a decision, again, from there. Jake, if you want to go to the next page. And Councilmember Marsh-Holsham, we knew that you would love the structured parking piece. And so we all kind of smiled when you called that out. So we sure appreciate that. So again, the repeatable filter through which these projects pass, Councilmember Schaaf, will continue to have this applied. The last thing I'll say is you could the term support. So when we look at the malls, we know that a shelf life of a mall is 20 years. It's probably 5 now, unless you do something, right? And so again, it has to be mobile, it has to be juicy, it has to be vibrant, it has to be adaptable. And Macerich is very good at continuing to make that happen. And they also agreed that our level of commitment would be commensurate with a refined, instead of going out 20 years for our commitment, taking it to the 15 years, which is 2037, is also pretty unusual in a deal.
If I may add just to Ms. Hoffman's quick yes to the first question. One of the things, and Jacob or Scott can talk a little bit more about it, but once we made that decision, once this council made that commitment and made that investment, they began to move forward with their investment. It also caused some tenants to start thinking about their decisions. And so what was really important for us, if you recall from that October conversation, but every conversation we've had since, was protecting that asset and allowing that asset to become stronger and better as it goes forward. So that 1.2 million square feet, while is not a trivial part, it's in fact the core part of this. And what they have already been able to do is resecure leases and secure tenant investments. And they have indicated that to us. We continue to have regular conversations on every element of this, but also where they are on that leasing and that reinvestment, because that's critically important to us. It's not just the 300,000 square feet. It's about what happens in the 1.2 million. And they have already started to do that, and their tenants have responded because of the city's investment and their investment in the project.
Thank you. That sounds great. Those are my questions. And I just wanted to say, I also appreciate your commitment to sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Ward.
Joy. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Just a quick question on transit. It says you have bus stops put on there. Are you anticipating expanded RTD service, or is that for an in-house circulator? What exactly are you anticipating those bus stops being?
So there's bus stops that occur today. So we're on the line.
Yeah, I know there is one there,
Yeah.
but there's the one that's on the opposite side of Dillard's
Yeah.
that does not currently exist.
It's a conversation to be had. We haven't gotten that far, but we're absolutely supportive of figuring that out. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And then just like Councilmember Marsh-Holston said, I still irk at the sea of parking on the north end, but I am happy that you could potentially be repurposing those surface parking lots later on for other more useful uses. That's it.
Thank you. Any additional questions from my colleagues? Doesn't appear to be any. I do want to thank you, Jacob, Megan, and Scott for being here tonight, and your reinvestment in this project. As you know, as you've heard, the mall is an important part of Broomfield, and we do appreciate that. Appreciate your commitments to the sustainability, affordability, and the trail connections, which I could say for myself could use a little bit updating, particularly on the signage, but really maybe not your concern or not, but I did get lost there about a month ago or two. Somehow got off of the US 36 trail, was in the Macy's parking lots, and had to figure out how to get back onto it. So not sure how that happened. It's not for you. But two quick, really hard hitting questions for you. And this is, I haven't been to the mall, unfortunately, for a little while. Just wondering, are there any plans to increase the closing time beyond 8 o'clock? Because I know everything kind of closes down early, and for myself, usually after I'm done eating, it's not much time to get to the mall at that point. So,
Do you have any thoughts, Megan? Put you on the spot.
And my second one is just kind of wondering how the vacancy rate is. And I know you had some general numbers, but I'm just wondering how the vacancy rate at the mall is right now, how the food court's doing. A lot of that was pretty empty last time I had been there.
We're getting out of here.
I know. I would say, as far as hours are concerned, with COVID, we've seen some of the hours just shortened across the board.
Mhm.
So I don't know that that we'll expand them. Obviously, that's going to end up being what's, retailer and customer demand. And if there's demand for it to expand, then that's something, we would obviously revisit. In regards to vacancy, I think that, right now, I think we showed it was at 91% occupancy. We have seen some vacancy over the last, year or so. What we are seeing though is when we do see vacancy, we've been able to backfill in some other spots. So I think that's kind of showing the stability of the center, is that when someone leaves, we've been able to backfill another location. So I think through the recession, through the pandemic, we're really feeling good about how solid the center is. But to someone's point earlier, you know, you have to reinvent it, because that really is, that is what you do in order to stay relevant in all of these shopping centers. So I think that's an integral part for us to move forward. But right now, I think we're feeling good from an occupancy standpoint that we have been able to sustain, especially with giving the information about the redevelopment. That's really been key in order to maintain the tenants that we do have right now.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So just to summarize going forward, it sounds like that you guys have been doing a lot of internal work, planning, and then the next steps are to get an STP in front of council. Then they hear you're hoping to break some ground on this project sometime next year. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you again for your coming out here tonight. And I think that concludes our second agenda item. There being no further business in front of council, the study session is adjourned.